In the beginning there was darkness, not the darkness of absence, but the fertile darkness of the unconscious, where all possibilities gestate in silence before their birth into awareness, and within this primordial realm a shadow learned to walk upright, wearing the mask of love, while feeding on the very essence of those it claimed to cherish. This is the ancient story, older than recorded history, written in the hieroglyphs of human suffering across millennia. In every culture, in every age, there have been those who discovered the terrible secret that the human heart, in its desperate hunger for connection, will open its gates to almost any visitor who speaks the language of belonging. And some visitors, having forgotten their own capacity for authentic love, learned instead to feast upon this openness like psychic vampires, draining the life force from others while convincing their victims that this exchange was wholly necessary, even healing. You know this story, though perhaps you have never named it. You have felt it moving beneath the surface of your most intimate relationships, a current of unease that you could never quite grasp with your conscious mind. It manifests in that sinking feeling when someone's words of love feel like chains around your soul. It appears in the confusion that follows conversations where somehow, despite your best intentions, you find yourself apologizing for existing, for having needs, for taking up space in the world. The sorcerer's spell is cast not through grand gestures or dramatic proclamations, but through the subtle alchemy of emotional manipulation, a dark magic so sophisticated that its victims often become its most devoted practitioners. Like the mythical sirens whose songs lured sailors to their doom, the emotional manipulator learns to sing the songs that each individual soul most desperately needs to hear. They become masters of the unspoken language of wounds, speaking directly to the abandoned child within us, the part that still believes love must be earned through suffering, through the sacrifice of our authentic selves upon the altar of another's ego. But understand this, the manipulator is not a monster born from some alien realm. They are us, projected outward, the shadow aspect of our own unlived lives, our own unintegrated hunger for power and control. They represent what Jung called the inferior function made manifest, the underdeveloped aspects of our psyche that, when left unconscious, can possess us entirely. Every manipulator was once a victim. Every victim carries within them the seeds of manipulation. This recognition is both terrifying and liberating, for it means that our healing and theirs are ultimately the same process, the integration of shadow, the return to wholeness, the remembering of our original nature before the wounding began. The spell works because it operates in the realm between consciousness and unconsciousness, in that liminal space where our deepest programming resides. The manipulator intuitively understands that we are all walking around with invisible wounds, psychic injuries sustained in childhood, when our young nervous systems were forming their fundamental beliefs about love, safety, and belonging. They know that embedded within each of us is a story about what we must do or be in order to be worthy of love, and they speak directly to this story with the precision of a master musician playing upon the strings of a finely tuned instrument. Consider how the spell manifests. The gradual erosion of your sense of reality through contradictory messages, the way your perceptions are subtly questioned until you begin to doubt your own experience. This is the phenomenon that modern psychology has named gaslighting, after the 1944 film in which a husband systematically drives his wife to question her sanity. But the roots of this behavior stretch back to the earliest power dynamics in human civilization, to the moment when one human being discovered that another's reality could be shaped, molded, and ultimately controlled through the careful application of emotional pressure. The manipulator creates what we might call a psychological labyrinth, a complex maze of emotional triggers, guilt patterns, and reward systems, designed to keep their victims moving in circles, always seeking the exit, but never quite finding it. They become the minotaur at the center of this maze, feeding on the confusion and desperation of those who have lost their way. And like the mythical labyrinth of ancient Crete, this psychological prison is constructed with such cunning that escape seems impossible without the guiding thread of consciousness, the Ariadne's thread of awareness that can lead us back to the light. The spell feeds on our deepest human needs, the need to be seen, understood, valued, and loved. But the manipulator offers us a counterfeit version of these experiences, a shadow love that promises fulfillment, while systematically depleting our life force. They create an addictive cycle where we receive just enough genuine-seeming affection to keep us hoping, interspersed with periods of withdrawal, criticism, or emotional abandonment that leave us desperate to regain their approval. This intermittent reinforcement schedule, well documented in behavioral psychology, creates one of the strongest forms of psychological conditioning known to science. Yet within this seemingly hopeless dynamic lies the seed of its own destruction, for the spell of manipulation can only survive in the darkness of unconsciousness. Like a vampire that turns to dust when exposed to sunlight, the manipulative dynamic begins to lose its power the moment it is clearly seen and named. This is why the manipulator works so hard to keep their victims confused, reactive, and self-doubting, because clarity of perception is the one thing their false kingdom cannot withstand. The 5 words that shatter this spell are not magic in the supernatural sense, but they carry the power of what Jung called the transcendent function, the psychological mechanism by which consciousness emerges from the union of opposites. These words represent the moment when the victim recognizes the game being played and refuses to continue participating in their own psychological imprisonment. They are the sword of truth that cuts through illusion, the light that penetrates darkness, the voice of the authentic self speaking through the fog of manipulation. But to understand the true power of these words, we must first descend deeper into the anatomy of emotional manipulation itself. We must understand how the spell is cast, what keeps it in place, and why we in our wounded innocence become so willing to collaborate in our own enchantment. For the path to freedom always begins with understanding the nature of our imprisonment, and the journey toward authentic relationship must traverse the shadowlands of unconscious projection and psychic vampirism. The manipulator's greatest skill lies not in their ability to deceive others, but in their capacity to remain unconscious of their own manipulation. They have learned to hide their predatory behavior even from themselves, wrapping it in elaborate justifications and noble-sounding rationalizations. They may speak of love while practicing control, of healing while inflicting harm, of service while demanding sacrifice. This self-deception is not a bug in their psychological system. It is a feature, protecting them from the unbearable recognition of what they have become. And so the dance continues. Victim and perpetrator locked in an unconscious tango, each playing their assigned role with tragic precision. The victim offers their life force, their authenticity, their very soul, believing this sacrifice will finally earn them the love they seek. The manipulator feeds on this offering while simultaneously punishing the giver for their weakness, their neediness, their willingness to be consumed. Neither party recognizes the deeper pattern at play, the way they are both prisoners of forces larger than their individual consciousness, until in a moment of grace that arrives like lightning in a dark sky, something shifts. A word is spoken, a boundary is drawn, a mirror is held up to reflect the truth of what has been hidden in shadow. In that instant the spell begins to unravel, and both prisoner and jailer are offered the possibility of freedom, though not all will choose to walk through the door when it opens. This is where our story truly begins. Deep within the psyche of every master manipulator lies an ancient blueprint, a sacred geometry of suffering that they learned to read long before they understood its devastating power. They are the architects of invisible prisons, designing elaborate structures not of stone and steel but of guilt and shame, fear and false hope. These psychological edifices rise from the bedrock of human vulnerability, their foundations sunk deep into the fertile soil of our unhealed wounds. To understand how these emotional dungeons are constructed, we must first recognize that every manipulator is simultaneously architect and prisoner of their own design. They inhabit the very structures they create, trapped within the same patterns they impose upon others. Like the mythical Daedalus, who built the labyrinth that would eventually imprison his own son, they craft mazes of meaning that ensnare both victim and perpetrator in an endless dance of unconscious projection. The blueprint they follow is written in the language of attachment trauma, those early experiences of love and abandonment that shape our fundamental understanding of relationship itself. Within the first few years of life, when our nervous systems are most plastic and our psyches most impressionable, we learn the unspoken rules of emotional survival. We discover what expressions of authentic self are welcomed and which must be buried in the shadow. We internalize the conditions under which love is offered and withdrawn, creating internal programs that will run, largely unconsciously, for the rest of our lives unless brought into the light of awareness. The emotional manipulator learned early that direct expression of need was dangerous, that vulnerability was weakness, that love was a zero-sum game where someone must always win and someone must always lose. They discovered that by becoming invisible, by adapting themselves perfectly to the expectations of their caregivers, they could avoid the terror of abandonment. But in making themselves invisible, they lost contact with their authentic self, that eternal spark of individuality that Jung recognized as the true center of psychological wholeness. Now, as adults, they construct relationships that replicate these early dynamics, but with a crucial reversal. They position themselves as the powerful parent figure, while casting their partners, friends, or family members in the role of the needy, difficult child. This unconscious role reversal allows them to experience a sense of control and safety they never had in childhood, but it comes at the terrible cost of authentic intimacy and genuine love. The architecture they create is both sophisticated and primitive, like a modern skyscraper built upon ancient burial grounds. At its foundation lies the manipulation of basic human needs, the need for safety, belonging, understanding, and love. They learn to position themselves as the sole source of these necessities, creating artificial scarcity where abundance should naturally flow. Like a drug dealer who creates dependence by controlling supply, they offer just enough emotional nourishment to keep their victims hungry, but never enough to satisfy the deeper spiritual longing for authentic connection. The first floor of their psychological prison is constructed from what we might call reality distortion. They become masters of rewriting history, of presenting alternate interpretations of events that leave their victims questioning their own perceptions and memories. This is not always conscious deception. Often they genuinely believe their distorted version of reality, having lived within their own maze of self-justification for so long that they can no longer distinguish between truth and projection. They create what psychologists recognize as cognitive dissonance in their victims, that uncomfortable psychological tension that arises when our beliefs conflict with our experience. When someone we love treats us with cruelty while insisting they are acting out of love, our minds struggle to reconcile this contradiction. Rather than face the terrifying possibility that someone we depend upon is harmful to us, we often choose to doubt our own experience, to gaslight ourselves in service of maintaining the illusion of safety. The second floor of their construction is built from emotional vampirism, the systematic draining of their victims' life force through manufactured crises, constant neediness, and the projection of their own unprocessed emotions. They become emotional black holes, sucking all the light and energy from those around them while somehow managing to remain perpetually empty themselves. This is because they are trying to fill an existential void through external means, seeking through others the connection to their own authentic self that was severed in childhood. They create elaborate dramas that position them as either the helpless victim in need of rescue, or the superior being, whose wisdom and guidance are essential for their victim's survival. Sometimes they alternate between these roles with dizzying speed, keeping their victims off balance and reactive. Like the mythical shapeshifters of ancient folklore, they become whatever they need to be in order to maintain their psychological dominance. The third floor houses their projection chambers, those psychological spaces where they deposit all the aspects of themselves they cannot bear to face. Their own rage becomes their victim's anger problem. Their own selfishness becomes their victim's narcissism. Their own desperate neediness becomes their victim's clinginess. Through this unconscious sleight of mind, they maintain their idealized self-image, while forcing others to carry the shadow aspects of their personality. This projection serves a dual purpose. It protects their fragile ego from the devastating recognition of their own shadow material, while simultaneously creating in their victims the very behaviors they claim to despise. When you constantly tell someone they are angry, selfish, or needy, they may eventually become these things, not because it was their true nature, but because the human psyche tends to fulfill the expectations placed upon it, especially when those expectations come from someone we love or depend upon. The fourth floor of their prison is constructed from intermittent reinforcement, the strategic alternation between reward and punishment that creates one of the strongest forms of psychological conditioning known to behavioral science. They learn to offer hope just when despair reaches its peak, to provide affection precisely when their victim has begun to give up, to promise change at the exact moment when their victim has gathered the courage to leave. This creates what trauma researchers call trauma bonding, a powerful attachment that forms not despite the abuse, but because of it. The nervous system, flooded with stress hormones during periods of conflict, experiences the manipulator's periodic kindness as intensely pleasurable relief. This biochemical high becomes addictive, creating a cycle where the victim actually begins to crave the very dynamic that is destroying them. The penthouse of their psychological architecture is reserved for their most sophisticated tool, the weaponization of love itself. They learn to present their controlling behavior as care, their invasion of boundaries as concern, their emotional vampirism as intimacy. They speak the language of love while practicing the art of war, using their victims' deepest values and spiritual beliefs as weapons against them. They may say things like, "If you really loved me, you would," or "I'm only trying to help you become your best self," or "You're being selfish for having needs that conflict with mine." They twist the victim's own growth-oriented language back against them, making self-care seem selfish, boundary setting seem cruel, and authentic self-expression seem like betrayal. But here is the profound secret that every manipulator fails to understand. Their elaborate architectural projects always contain the seeds of their own destruction. Like the mythical Tower of Babel, these structures built on falsehood and projection inevitably reach a height where they can no longer support their own weight. The more sophisticated the manipulation becomes, the more energy it requires to maintain, until eventually the manipulator exhausts themselves, trying to control variables that are ultimately beyond their influence. The awakening consciousness of their victims. For consciousness, once sparked, spreads like wildfire through even the most carefully constructed psychological prison. A single moment of clear seeing can illuminate years of shadow manipulation, and suddenly the victim begins to recognize the patterns, to name the behaviors, to question the narratives that have held them captive. This is the beginning of what Jung called the individuation process, the psychological journey toward wholeness that necessarily involves the integration of shadow and the reclamation of authentic selfhood. The manipulator's greatest fear, though they may not consciously recognize it, is not the loss of their victim. It is the mirror their victim's awakening holds up to their own unconscious behavior. For in the moment when their victim clearly sees and names the manipulation, the manipulator is forced to confront the shadow aspects of themselves they have worked so desperately to project onto others. This confrontation with their own darkness is simultaneously their greatest terror and their greatest opportunity for healing. And so we see that the architecture of emotional enslavement, for all its complexity and sophistication, is ultimately built upon a foundation of fear. The manipulator's fear of their own shadow, their terror of authentic intimacy, their desperate attempt to control others rather than face the uncontrollable truth of their own woundedness. These structures can only exist in the darkness of unconsciousness, and they begin to crumble the moment they are exposed to the light of clear awareness. This is why the 5 words that shatter manipulation carry such transformative power. They are not merely words, but acts of consciousness that illuminate the shadow dynamics that have been operating in darkness. They transform victim into witness, reaction into response, unconscious participation into conscious choice. They mark the moment when the prisoner realizes they have always held the key to their own freedom. Before the sword of truth can be drawn from its stone, before the 5 sacred words can be spoken with authentic power, the would-be liberator must first descend into their own underworld, that shadowy realm where all our disowned experiences dwell in exile, waiting to be reclaimed or forever seeking expression through projection onto others. This descent is not optional for those who would break free from manipulation's spell. It is the prerequisite for all genuine healing, the initiatory journey that transforms victim into wounded healer. Here, in the depths of honest self-examination, we encounter the most uncomfortable recognition of all. We have been here before, on both sides of this ancient dance. Perhaps we were the child who learned to manipulate our parents' emotions to get our needs met when direct requests were met with rejection or rage. Perhaps we were the teenager who discovered that playing victim could shield us from accountability, or that controlling others felt safer than risking the vulnerability of authentic relationship. Perhaps we are the adult who still, in moments of fear or desperation, reaches for these same shadowy tools when our more evolved strategies fail us. This recognition pierces through our carefully constructed identity as the good one, the victim, the one who would never hurt anyone. It forces us to confront what Jung called the shadow, not just our capacity for darkness, but our active participation in the very dynamics we claim to despise. The shadow does not consist merely of evil impulses we have repressed. It contains all the aspects of ourselves that we have deemed unacceptable, including our own power, our own capacity for manipulation, our own hunger for control. To see this clearly requires what the mystics have always called the dark night of the soul, that period of spiritual crisis where all our comfortable illusions about ourselves dissolve, leaving us naked before the truth of our own complexity. We begin to remember moments when we used guilt to control others, when we played victim to avoid responsibility, when we projected our own unprocessed emotions onto those who loved us. We recall times when we stayed in destructive relationships, not out of love, but out of our own unconscious need to play out familiar patterns of suffering and control. This remembering is excruciating precisely because it shatters our identification with innocence, with being only the wounded rather than also the wounder. Yet this shattering is also the birth of genuine compassion, for how can we truly understand another's darkness if we have never acknowledged our own? How can we respond to manipulation from a place of centered wisdom rather than reactive victimhood unless we have integrated our own manipulative shadow? The wounded healer archetype, present in every wisdom tradition across human history, represents this crucial understanding. Our greatest wounds become our greatest sources of healing power, but only after they have been consciously integrated rather than unconsciously projected. The Greek god Chiron, wounded by an arrow that could never heal, became the greatest teacher of healing arts precisely because his perpetual pain gave him intimate knowledge of suffering and the pathways to wholeness. In the context of emotional manipulation, we discover that our susceptibility to these dynamics arose not from some fundamental flaw in our character, but from the intelligent adaptations our young psyches made to survive in environments where authentic selfhood was not safe. The child who learned to read every micro-expression on their parent's face, to anticipate and manage every mood shift, to become invisible when anger arose and indispensable when love was offered. This child developed extraordinary sensitivity and emotional intelligence as survival mechanisms. But these same gifts, when carried unconsciously into adult relationships, create the very vulnerabilities that manipulators instinctively recognize and exploit. Our hypervigilance to others' emotional states makes us perfect targets for those who have learned to weaponize emotion. Our deep capacity for empathy becomes a doorway through which emotional vampires enter to feed on our life force. Our willingness to sacrifice our own needs for the sake of relationship harmony makes us ideal candidates for psychological enslavement. The recognition phase of healing involves tracing these patterns back to their origins, understanding the childhood decisions and adaptations that created them. We begin to see how our adult relationship patterns are often unconscious attempts to heal our original wounds by recreating them in the hope that this time we will find a way to earn the unconditional love that was missing in our early experiences. The woman who repeatedly attracts narcissistic partners may be unconsciously trying to heal her relationship with a narcissistic parent by finally succeeding in making such a person truly see and value her. The man who becomes involved with emotionally volatile partners may be attempting to prove that he can provide enough stability and patience to calm the storms that raged through his childhood home. These unconscious healing fantasies keep us locked in repetitive patterns until we bring them into the light of consciousness. We must recognize that we cannot heal our past through our present relationships, that the wounded child within us will never receive the perfect love they needed from external sources, not because love is unavailable in the world, but because the healing of these early wounds is ultimately an inside job, a reclaiming of our own capacity to provide ourselves with the acceptance and understanding we once sought from others. This recognition brings us face to face with the existential loneliness that is the human condition, the understanding that, no matter how intimate our relationships become, we ultimately exist in separate subjective realities that can touch but never merge. This loneliness terrifies us, and it is this terror that makes us susceptible to manipulation's false promise of merger, of finding someone who will complete us, understand us totally, and take away the fundamental isolation of individual existence. But within this recognition of existential aloneness lies a profound liberation. If we cannot be completed by another, then we also cannot be destroyed by another's withdrawal of love. If we are ultimately responsible for our own emotional well-being, then we are also ultimately free from the tyranny of needing others to be different than they are in order for us to be okay. This is the birth of what Jung called psychological independence, not the neurotic independence that fears intimacy, but the mature autonomy that can engage intimately without losing itself. The wounded healer's journey requires us to grieve the fantasy of perfect love that can heal all wounds. The dream of finding someone who will see us so completely that we never have to face our own shadow. We must mourn the loss of our innocence, the comfortable position of being only victim and never perpetrator. This grieving process is essential, for we cannot integrate what we have not first acknowledged, and we cannot heal what we continue to deny exists within us. As this integration deepens, we begin to develop what might be called shadow immunity, the capacity to recognize and respond to others' unconscious projections without being infected by them. We learn to see manipulation not as a personal attack on our worth, but as a projection of the manipulator's own unintegrated wounds. We develop the ability to say, in essence, I see that you are in pain, and I have compassion for your suffering, but I will not participate in dynamics that require me to abandon my own authenticity in service of your unconscious healing fantasies. This shadow immunity does not make us hard or unloving. Rather, it allows us to love more authentically because we are no longer confusing, enabling with caring, rescuing with healing, or self-abandonment with devotion. We can offer genuine compassion to manipulators while maintaining the boundaries necessary for our own psychological health. We can see their behavior as a symptom of their own unhealed wounds, without taking responsibility for healing those wounds through our own self-sacrifice. The wounded healer understands that true healing always involves the integration of opposites, light and shadow, victim and perpetrator, wound and gift. They know that the very sensitivity that made them vulnerable to manipulation also gives them the capacity for deep empathy and intuitive understanding. They recognize that their experience of being on both sides of unconscious dynamics has given them a kind of psychological wisdom that cannot be acquired through books or theories alone. This hard-won wisdom becomes the foundation from which the 5 sacred words can be spoken, not from a place of victimized reactivity or righteous anger, but from the centered clarity of one who has walked through the fire of self-examination and emerged with their authentic power intact. The wounded healer speaks these words not to wound, but to heal, to offer both themselves and the manipulator the possibility of stepping out of unconscious patterns into conscious relationship. In the labyrinth of human exchange, where words weave webs of intention and meaning, dances with deception, there exist certain phrases that carry within them the concentrated power of millennia, sacred utterances that have been whispered by shamans in firelit ceremonies, spoken by mystics in monastery cells, and discovered anew by every soul brave enough to claim its own authentic voice. These are not mere collections of syllables, but archetypal keys that unlock the hidden chambers of psychological manipulation, bringing to light what prefers to operate in shadow. The first sacred word phrase emerges from the depths, like a sword pulled from still water. I notice. These two words, so simple in their construction, carry within them the entire weight of conscious awareness awakening from its slumber. When you speak them, when you truly embody their meaning, you step out of the unconscious dance of manipulation and into the role of witness, observer, the one who sees. The manipulator, accustomed to operating in the twilight realm of suggestion and implication, suddenly finds themselves illuminated by the searchlight of direct observation. I notice that when I express my needs, the conversation somehow always shifts to your struggles. The words hang in the air like incense, carrying with them not accusation but simple, devastating clarity. The manipulator, so skilled in the art of deflection, discovers that their technique has been named, witnessed, brought into the harsh light of conscious recognition. They cannot argue with what has been noticed. They can only reveal more of their pattern through their response. This first sacred phrase operates like the hermit's lamp in the tarot, illuminating not to judge, but to reveal truth. It transforms you from participant to observer, from unconscious reactor to conscious witness. The manipulator's greatest weapon, your unconsciousness of their tactics, is neutralized by the simple act of noticing and speaking what you see. The second sacred phrase rises from even deeper waters. That's interesting. These words carry within them the alchemical power of curiosity meeting manipulation. Where the manipulator expects emotional reaction, hurt, confusion, defensiveness, they encounter instead the cool gaze of scientific observation. You become, in that moment, an anthropologist studying the fascinating behaviors of the human species, noting with genuine interest the intricate patterns of psychological manipulation. That's interesting, you ask for my trust while simultaneously questioning my perceptions. The phrase creates a kind of psychological aikido, using the manipulator's own energy against them. They have crafted their words to create a specific emotional response, to hook your insecurities and drag you into their drama. Instead, you meet their manipulation with the transformative power of curiosity. The hook finds no purchase on the smooth surface of genuine interest. This response does something profound to the manipulator's psyche. They have built their entire strategy around your predictable reactions, your need to defend, to explain, to prove your worth. When instead you become curious about their behavior, you step entirely outside their game. They find themselves, perhaps for the first time, having to explain their tactics rather than watching those tactics work their magic on your emotions. The third sacred phrase emerges from the realm of the fool, that archetypal figure who speaks truth precisely because they claim to know nothing. I don't understand. These three words, spoken with genuine innocence, become a mirror that forces the manipulator to see their own reflection. They have crafted elaborate constructions of half-truth and implication, Byzantine arguments designed to confuse and disorient. When met with simple, honest confusion, these constructions collapse under their own complexity. I don't understand how my asking you to listen becomes proof that I don't care about your feelings. The manipulator, faced with this response, must either clarify their position, thus revealing its absurdity, or retreat into even more convoluted explanations that only serve to highlight the manipulation more clearly. They cannot maintain their stance in the face of genuine incomprehension because their stance is fundamentally incomprehensible. This phrase reconnects you with what Jung called the child archetype, that part of the psyche that approaches the world with fresh eyes and genuine curiosity. The child within you genuinely doesn't understand how manipulation works, because manipulation requires a kind of cynical sophistication that the child mind lacks. By speaking from this place, you force the interaction back into simplicity and truth. The fourth sacred phrase springs from the well of personal sovereignty, That doesn't work for me. These 5 words establish a boundary that cannot be argued with, negotiated around, or manipulated away. They do not invite debate or discussion. They simply state a reality that exists as surely as mountains exist, as certainly as rivers flow toward the sea. That doesn't work for me. Sidesteps the entire elaborate theater of manipulation. The manipulator has constructed scenarios, created urgencies, manufactured crises, all designed to make you feel that you have no choice but to comply with their wishes. This phrase reveals the profound truth that you always have a choice, always possess the sovereign right to decline what doesn't serve your authentic nature. When you speak these words, you invoke what Jung understood as the transcendent function, that mysterious capacity of the psyche to find a third way beyond the apparent duality of compliance or conflict. The manipulator presents you with what appears to be a binary choice: submit to their demands or face their wrath. This phrase reveals the existence of door number 3, simply not participating in their construction of reality. The manipulator, faced with this response, often experiences a kind of cognitive dissonance. Their entire system depends on your belief that you must engage with their framework, must find a way to work within the parameters they have established. When you simply state that their framework doesn't work for you, you step outside their constructed reality entirely. The 5th and most powerful sacred phrase emerges from the deepest wisdom traditions of humanity: I'm not responsible for your emotions. These 7 words carry within them the accumulated insight of every mystic who has learned to distinguish between compassion and codependency, between love and enabling, between care and rescue. This phrase cuts through perhaps the most sophisticated manipulation of all: the implicit demand that you manage another person's emotional state, that you sacrifice your own needs to maintain their psychological equilibrium. It recognizes the profound truth that while we can influence each other's emotions, we cannot and must not take responsibility for them. Each soul must learn to carry its own emotional weather, to find its own path through the storms of feeling and the seasons of the heart. I'm not responsible for your emotions doesn't mean you don't care. It means you care enough to allow the other person their full humanity, including their capacity to feel difficult emotions and learn from them. It means you refuse to participate in the unconscious contract that keeps both of you locked in patterns of manipulation and rescue. When these 5 sacred phrases are integrated into your being, when they become not just words you speak but truths you embody, they create around you what might be called a field of authenticity. This field operates like a kind of psychological immune system, naturally repelling manipulation while attracting genuine connection. The manipulator, sensing this field, often finds themselves unable to maintain their usual patterns in your presence. They may become frustrated, confused, or even aggressive as their familiar tactics fail to find purchase on your newfound sovereignty. But here lies perhaps the greatest gift of these sacred words. They don't just protect you from manipulation, they offer the manipulator an opportunity for their own awakening. When their patterns are consistently met with consciousness rather than unconscious reaction, they are forced to confront their own shadows, their own wounds, their own desperate attempts to meet legitimate needs through illegitimate means. The person who manipulates is at bottom a wounded child trying to get their needs met through the only strategies they learned in their early encounters with an often harsh and unpredictable world. When you respond to their manipulation with conscious presence rather than unconscious reaction, you offer them something they may never have experienced before: the possibility of authentic relationship, of having their real needs seen and honored, without the elaborate theater of emotional manipulation. This is the deeper alchemy these sacred words perform. They transform not just your experience of relationship, but potentially the relationship itself. They create space for genuine intimacy to emerge from behind the masks of manipulation and people-pleasing. Space for 2 authentic beings to meet in truth rather than in the shadowland of unconscious patterns. Yet, speaking these words requires what Jung called moral courage, the willingness to risk another person's anger or disappointment in service of your own truth. The manipulator has trained you through countless subtle punishments and rewards to prioritize their comfort over your authenticity. These sacred phrases require you to reverse that programming, to choose your own truth, even when it makes others uncomfortable. This choice, to speak these words, to embody their truth, is itself a form of individuation, that lifelong process by which the soul separates itself from the collective unconscious and claims its own unique reality. Every time you say "I notice" instead of remaining unconscious, every time you respond with "that's interesting" instead of defensiveness, every time you claim "that doesn't work for me" instead of compliance, you take another step on the path towards psychological wholeness. The sacred words become, over time, internalized voices of wisdom, archetypal guardians that protect the integrity of your inner landscape. They teach you to distinguish between appropriate guilt, the kind that arises when you have actually caused harm, and manufactured guilt, the kind that manipulators create to control your behavior. They help you separate your emotions from others' emotions, your needs from others' expectations, your truth from others' projections. In the mythology of transformation, there are always threshold guardians, fierce protectors who challenge the hero before they can pass into the realm of greater wisdom and power. These 5 sacred phrases serve as your own internal threshold guardians, automatically arising when someone attempts to manipulate your consciousness or violate your psychological boundaries. They require no effort once integrated. They simply emerge like antibodies in a healthy immune system whenever manipulation is detected. The journey towards speaking these sacred words authentically is itself a hero's journey, requiring you to descend into your own underworld of people-pleasing and conflict avoidance, to face the dragons of your own need for approval and your terror of abandonment. Only when you have made peace with these inner shadows can you speak the words with the kind of integrated presence that makes them truly effective. For these are not weapons to be wielded against others, but medicine to be taken for your own healing. They work their magic not through force but through the mysterious alchemy that occurs when consciousness meets unconsciousness, when truth encounters deception, when authentic presence faces manipulative strategy. In that meeting, something transforms not just in you but in the very field of relationship itself. The manipulator, faced with these responses, must choose, continue their unconscious patterns and find them increasingly ineffective, or begin their own journey toward greater consciousness and authentic relationship. Either way, you have done your part in the great work of bringing more awareness into the world, of refusing to participate in the unconscious patterns that keep humanity trapped in cycles of manipulation and suffering. And in that refusal, in that choice to speak these sacred words, you join the ancient lineage of those who have chosen consciousness over comfort, truth over convenience, authentic relationship over the safe but soul-deadening patterns of unconscious interaction. You become, in your own small but significant way, an agent of transformation in a world that desperately needs more conscious, authentic, courageously truthful human beings. These words, simple as they appear, carry within them the power to revolutionize not just your relationships, but your entire experience of being human. They are invitations to step out of the old story of victimhood and manipulation and into the new story of conscious choice and authentic presence. They are keys to the kingdom of psychological sovereignty, passwords to the realm of genuine intimacy, sacred utterances that call forth the deepest truth of who you really are. There exists in the realm of human consciousness a phenomenon that the ancient alchemists would have recognized immediately, that singular moment when base metal transforms into gold, when the ordinary substance of everyday interaction suddenly transmutes into something luminous and transformative. This is not metaphor, but lived reality, as concrete and observable as any chemical reaction, yet as mysterious and profound as any spiritual awakening. It occurs in the precise instant when conscious awareness penetrates the fog of manipulation, when sacred words are spoken with authentic presence, when the victim suddenly remembers they are, and have always been, the author of their own story. Picture, if you will, the moment before this transformation occurs. The psychological atmosphere is thick with confusion, dense with the kind of emotional smog that manipulation creates. The manipulator has woven their spell with masterful precision, creating a reality in which you doubt your own perceptions, question your own needs, apologize for your own existence. They have succeeded in making you smaller, dimmer, less real than you actually are. You stand in this manufactured twilight, feeling as though you are disappearing even as you struggle to hold on to some fragment of your authentic self. The manipulator, meanwhile, exists in what they imagine to be a position of power. They have orchestrated this entire theater, pulled the strings that make you dance to their emotional music, created the very reality in which you both now exist. They are the director of this play, the conductor of this symphony of confusion. They believe themselves to be in control, masters of the psychological realm they have constructed through years of practiced manipulation. But consciousness, like water finding its way through rock, has a way of emerging even in the most carefully controlled environments. Something stirs within you. Perhaps it is Jung's self beginning to assert its primacy over the wounded ego. Perhaps it is simply the soul's innate refusal to remain diminished indefinitely. Whatever name we give this force, it begins to move through you like light breaking through storm clouds. And then it happens. The moment of reversal arrives with the sudden clarity of dawn breaking over mountains. You speak one of the sacred phrases. I notice that when I try to explain my feelings, you immediately begin talking about how difficult your life is, and the entire psychological landscape shifts with tectonic force. In that instant, the manipulator experiences what can only be described as a kind of psychological whiplash. They were operating in the familiar territory of emotional manipulation, confident in their ability to redirect conversations, deflect responsibility, and maintain control through confusion and misdirection. Suddenly, they find themselves illuminated by the harsh light of direct observation. Their carefully crafted reality is exposed as exactly that, a construction, a fabrication designed to serve their needs at the expense of truth. The moment is so precise, so definitive, that it often creates a kind of stunned silence. The manipulator, perhaps for the first time in years, has no immediate response. Their arsenal of tactics, deflection, projection, gaslighting, emotional manipulation, all seem suddenly inadequate in the face of simple, direct observation. They have been seen, truly seen. And their manipulative strategies have been named and witnessed. It is as though someone has suddenly turned on all the lights in a room where they were accustomed to operating in carefully managed shadows. For you, the moment carries an entirely different quality of transformation. Where confusion once reigned, clarity suddenly emerges with crystalline precision. Where you once felt small and uncertain, you now feel grounded in your own reality, solid in your own truth. It is as though you have suddenly remembered who you are after a long period of amnesia, as though you have awakened from a dream in which you had forgotten your own power. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of the transcendent function, that mysterious capacity of the psyche to find a third way beyond the apparent duality of victim and victimizer. In speaking these sacred words, you have accessed something beyond both submission and aggression, beyond both compliance and conflict. You have found the middle path of conscious witnessing, the royal road of authentic response. The alchemical transformation occurs not just within you individually, but in the very field of relationship itself. The entire energetic dynamic between you and the manipulator undergoes a fundamental shift. Where once there was a pursuer and a pursued, a predator and a prey, now there is simply consciousness meeting unconsciousness, truth encountering deception, authentic presence facing manufactured reality. The manipulator may respond to this shift in various ways, each response revealing more about their level of consciousness and their willingness to engage with truth. Some may become defensive, doubling down on their manipulative strategies with increased intensity. Others may become confused, genuinely bewildered by your sudden refusal to participate in patterns that have worked for them for years. Still others may experience their own moment of awakening, suddenly seeing their behavior reflected back to them with uncomfortable clarity. But regardless of how the manipulator responds, something irreversible has occurred within you. You have tasted the freedom that comes from refusing to participate in unconscious patterns. You have experienced the power that emerges when you choose consciousness over reactivity, truth over convenience. Like Persephone returning from the underworld, you carry with you the knowledge of both darkness and light, both victimhood and empowerment. This moment of reversal operates according to what Jung called the principle of enantiodromia, the tendency of psychological extremes to transform into their opposites. The very intensity of the manipulation creates the conditions for its own reversal. The more completely you have been diminished, the more powerful is your moment of reclaiming your authentic self. The more thoroughly you have been gaslit, the more brilliant is your return to your own truth. The alchemical metaphor is particularly apt here because, like the ancient alchemists working with base metals, this transformation requires both precise conditions and patient cultivation. The sacred words must be spoken not from a place of anger or retaliation, but from a centered place of conscious observation. They must emerge from what the alchemists would have called the philosophical mercury, that fluid intelligence that can perceive truth without being contaminated by it. In this moment of reversal, time itself seems to change its quality. The manipulator's reality, which seemed so solid and unchangeable just moments before, reveals itself to be as insubstantial as morning mist. The complex web of justifications, explanations, and emotional manipulations that seemed so convincing in the twilight of unconsciousness appears suddenly transparent when exposed to the light of direct awareness. You may notice in this transformative moment that your body responds as dramatically as your mind, where tension once lived in your shoulders, carrying the weight of others' expectations and your own self-doubt. You may suddenly feel a profound relaxation, as though you have set down a burden you didn't even realize you were carrying, where your breath once came shallow and quick, responding to the stress of constant vigilance and self-doubt. You may find yourself breathing deeply for the first time in months, or even years. This bodily transformation reflects the deeper truth that manipulation is not just a mental phenomenon, but a somatic one. The manipulator has trained your nervous system to respond with fear and compliance to their emotional demands. They have conditioned your body to carry their anxiety, to contract in response to their displeasure, to remain perpetually alert to their needs and moods. The moment of reversal liberates not just your mind but your entire being from this unconscious conditioning. The manipulator, witnessing this transformation, may experience their own somatic response. They are accustomed to reading the subtle signs of your submission, the way your voice becomes smaller when they express displeasure, the way your posture shifts when they project their anxiety onto you, the way your energy contracts when they flood you with their emotional chaos. Suddenly these familiar cues are absent. You stand before them in your full presence, no longer diminished by their projections or constrained by their expectations. This shift in your somatic presence often triggers what might be called a narcissistic shock in the manipulator. They are confronted not just with different words, but with a different quality of being, a different energetic signature that they cannot manipulate or control. It is as though the instrument they have been playing, your conditioned responses, has suddenly changed its tuning, making their familiar melodies impossible to perform. Yet this moment of reversal, profound as it is, represents not an end, but a beginning. It is the first step in a longer journey toward what Jung called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are rather than who others need you to be. The alchemical transformation from lead to gold was, for the ancient practitioners, not a single event, but an entire opus, a great work that required dedication, patience, and continuous refinement. Similarly, this moment of psychological reversal must be integrated and sustained. The manipulator, after their initial shock, may adapt their strategies, becoming more subtle or more intense in their attempts to re-establish the old pattern. They may test your newfound boundaries with increased pressure, like water finding new ways around a dam. Your task becomes not just experiencing this moment of transformation, but embodying it as a permanent shift in your way of being. The integration of this alchemical moment requires what the depth psychologists call holding the tension of the opposites. You must learn to maintain your centered presence, even when the manipulator escalates their tactics. You must hold your truth, even when they question your reality. You must remain grounded in your own experience, even when they flood you with their projections and accusations. This is where the real work begins, not in the dramatic moment of reversal itself, but in the patient, daily practice of living from this new place of consciousness. It requires developing what might be called psychological muscle memory, training your entire being to automatically respond from authenticity rather than from the old patterns of people-pleasing and conflict avoidance. The ancient alchemists spoke of the philosopher's stone, that legendary substance capable of transforming base metals into gold. In the realm of psychological transformation, these moments of reversal serve as your philosopher's stone, carrying within them the power to transmute the lead of unconscious reactivity into the gold of conscious response. But like the stone of legend, this power must be carefully guarded and wisely used. Each time you successfully navigate such a moment, each time you choose consciousness over reactivity, you add another layer to your philosopher's stone. You become more skillful at recognizing the early signs of manipulation, more adept at responding from your center rather than from your wounds, more capable of maintaining your truth even in the face of intense pressure to abandon it. The ripple effects of these moments extend far beyond your relationship with any particular manipulator. They begin to transform your entire way of being in the world. Other people sense the change in you, the increased solidity of your presence, the quiet confidence of someone who knows their own worth, the unshakable quality of someone who has reclaimed their psychological sovereignty. This transformation is not about becoming hard or defensive. Indeed, it often makes you more genuinely open and vulnerable, because you no longer need to protect yourself from authentic intimacy. When you know you can handle manipulation, when you trust your ability to maintain your center even in the face of intense pressure, you can afford to be genuinely soft with those who approach you with honest hearts. The moment of reversal becomes, over time, less dramatic but more constant. Rather than experiencing occasional breakthrough moments, you begin to live from a place of continuous consciousness, automatically recognizing and responding to manipulative patterns without the intense struggle that characterized your earlier encounters with such behavior. Yet, even as these moments become more natural, they retain their quality of magic, their sense of participating in something larger than ordinary human interaction. Each time you choose consciousness over unconsciousness, truth over deception, authentic presence over manipulative strategy, you participate in what Jung called the collective work of human evolution, the slow but steady movement of our species toward greater consciousness and more authentic ways of relating. In this sense, your personal alchemical moments of reversal become part of the larger alchemical work of transforming human civilization itself. Every time you refuse to participate in unconscious patterns of manipulation and control, you make it slightly easier for others to make the same choice. Every time you model conscious response in the face of unconscious provocation, you demonstrate that another way is possible. The ancient alchemists believed that their work in the laboratory was simultaneously a work of personal transformation and cosmic significance. They understood that, as they purified and transformed matter, they were also purifying and transforming themselves, participating in the great work of evolution itself. Your moments of psychological reversal carry this same dual significance. They transform not just your personal experience, but contribute to the larger transformation of human consciousness itself. This is the ultimate meaning of the alchemical moment of reversal. It is both profoundly personal and transpersonally significant, both an individual achievement and a contribution to the collective evolution of human awareness. In the precise instant when you speak those sacred words, when you step out of unconscious reactivity and into conscious response, you join the ancient lineage of alchemists, mystics, and psychological pioneers who have chosen transformation over stagnation, consciousness over comfort, truth over the easier path of unconscious compliance. In the ancient temples of wisdom, mirrors were not mere objects of vanity, but sacred instruments of revelation, polished surfaces that showed not just physical appearance, but the state of the soul itself. The priests and priestesses understood that truth, like light, travels in straight lines, and when it encounters the curved surface of self-deception, it reflects back with mathematical precision, revealing what the ego would prefer to keep hidden in shadow. The 5 sacred words operate with this same terrible honesty, this same uncompromising clarity that cuts through the elaborate constructions of the manipulative mind. When you speak them, I notice, that's interesting. I don't understand, that doesn't work for me. I'm not responsible for your emotions. You become like Perseus holding his polished shield, allowing the manipulator to see their own Medusa face reflected in the mirror of your conscious awareness. This is perhaps the most profound gift these words offer, though it may initially appear as punishment or cruelty to the one who receives their reflection. The manipulator has spent years, perhaps decades, constructing elaborate justifications for their behavior, weaving complex narratives in which their manipulative actions appear not only reasonable but necessary, even noble. They have told themselves they are protecting others from harsh truths, managing delicate situations with sophisticated emotional intelligence, or simply doing what must be done in a difficult world. But when these sacred words are spoken with authentic presence, all such justifications evaporate, like morning mist before the sun. The mirror of consciousness reflects back only what is actually happening, stripped of all the elaborate psychological costuming that the ego uses to dress up its shadow behaviors. The manipulator suddenly sees themselves not as they imagine themselves to be, but as they actually are in this moment, someone attempting to control another person's reality, someone using emotional pressure to get their needs met, someone operating from their wounded child rather than their integrated adult self. This reflection often comes as a profound shock to the manipulator's system. They have become so accustomed to operating in the twilight realm of implication and suggestion, so skilled at maintaining plausible deniability for their actions, that the stark clarity of direct observation can feel like a sudden blinding light in a room where they have long been comfortable in the shadows. I notice that whenever I express a concern, you immediately bring up something I did wrong 3 months ago. The words hang in the air like a perfectly accurate photograph, capturing behavior that the manipulator may have never seen clearly themselves. They cannot argue with what has been noticed because the observation is simply factual. They cannot deflect it because deflection itself would only provide more material for the mirror's reflection. They cannot gaslight it because the very act of gaslighting would be immediately visible in the polished surface of your awareness. This is what makes these words so powerful. They offer no handholds for the manipulator's usual techniques. When someone attacks you, you can defend yourself. When someone accuses you, you can counter-accuse. When someone argues with you, you can argue back. But when someone simply notices your behavior and reflects it back to you with clear, non-judgmental observation, there is nowhere to hide, nothing to fight against, no external enemy to blame for the uncomfortable truth that is being revealed. The mirror's honesty is terrible not because it is harsh or punishing, but because it is absolutely accurate and impossible to escape. Like the mythological mirror that could not lie, it shows the manipulator exactly what they are doing in this moment, exactly how their behavior is affecting the relationship, exactly what shadow they are casting while believing themselves to be standing in the light. This confrontation with their own reflection often triggers what Jung identified as enantiodromia, that mysterious tendency of the psyche to swing toward its opposite when pushed to an extreme. The manipulator, faced with the undeniable reality of their own behavior, may experience a sudden reversal of their usual patterns. They might become unusually quiet when they are typically overwhelming, unusually straightforward when they typically operate through indirection, unusually vulnerable when they typically maintain control through emotional manipulation. This swinging toward the opposite is not necessarily conscious or deliberate. It emerges from the deep structure of the psyche itself, which seeks balance and wholeness even when the conscious ego resists such integration. The manipulator, seeing themselves clearly for perhaps the first time in years, may access parts of their personality that have been buried beneath layers of defensive strategies and wounded reactivity. Sometimes this enantiodromia manifests as genuine remorse and a sincere desire to change their behavior. The shock of seeing themselves clearly can crack open the defensive shell that has long protected their wounded inner child, allowing more authentic aspects of their personality to emerge. They may suddenly remember who they were before they learned to manipulate, before they developed these elaborate strategies for getting their needs met through the control of others' emotions and perceptions. But just as often, the enantiodromia manifests as increased aggression or more sophisticated manipulation. The manipulator, feeling exposed and vulnerable in the harsh light of the mirror's reflection, may lash out with increased intensity, attempting to shatter the mirror rather than continue seeing themselves in it. They may escalate their tactics, becoming more overtly controlling, more dramatically emotional, more urgently demanding of your attention and compliance. This escalation paradoxically only serves to make their behavior even more visible in the mirror of your consciousness. The more frantically they attempt to avoid seeing themselves clearly, the more clearly their avoidance patterns become illuminated. It is like watching someone try to escape from a hall of mirrors. Every movement only creates more reflections, more opportunities to see what they are trying so desperately not to see. Your task in these moments is to maintain your role as the mirror, clear, steady, reflecting without distortion what is actually happening. This requires tremendous psychological discipline, because the manipulator's escalation is specifically designed to pull you out of your centered awareness and back into unconscious reactivity. They increase the pressure precisely to shatter your clarity, to cloud the mirror with emotional fog, so they can once again operate in comfortable shadows. But when you maintain your presence, when you continue to offer simple, clear observations without being pulled into drama or defensiveness, something extraordinary happens. The manipulator begins to exhaust themselves against the immovable surface of your awareness, like waves crashing against a cliff. Their manipulative attempts expend their energy without achieving their intended effect. They discover that their usual tactics not only fail to work, but actually make their behavior more transparently visible. The mirror's honesty extends beyond simply reflecting the manipulator's behavior. It also reflects the deeper psychological dynamics that drive that behavior. When you observe without judgment, when you notice without attacking, you create space for the wounded child within the manipulator to be seen alongside their defensive strategies. The mirror shows not just what they are doing, but the pain and fear that motivates what they are doing. I notice that you seem to need a lot of reassurance right now, and I'm wondering if there's something specific you're worried about. This kind of observation penetrates beneath the manipulative behavior to the underlying emotional reality, offering the manipulator a chance to connect with their authentic needs rather than their defensive strategies. This deeper reflection can be even more transformative than simply exposing the manipulation itself. The manipulator, seeing not just their behavior but the fear and pain that drives it, may suddenly access compassion for themselves, and in that moment of self-compassion find the strength to choose more authentic ways of getting their needs met. The mirror's terrible honesty also extends to your own reflection. As you hold up this clear surface for the manipulator to see themselves, you inevitably see yourself reflected as well. You may notice your own patterns of enabling, your own tendencies to rescue others from the consequences of their behavior, your own ways of avoiding difficult truths about the people you care about. This double reflection, seeing both the manipulator's patterns and your own participation in those patterns, is essential for true transformation. The mirror shows you not just how you are being manipulated, but how you have been complicit in your own manipulation, how your own wounds and fears have made you available for this kind of treatment. Perhaps you see your own desperate need for approval reflected in your willingness to accept manipulative behavior. Perhaps you notice your own fear of abandonment in your reluctance to set clear boundaries. Perhaps you recognize your own rescuer complex in your attempts to manage others' emotions rather than allowing them to experience the natural consequences of their actions. This self-reflection, though sometimes uncomfortable, is ultimately liberating. It shows you that you are not a helpless victim, but an active participant in your own experience, someone with the power to choose different responses and create different outcomes. The mirror's honesty extends to showing you your own strength, your own capacity for growth, your own ability to break free from unconscious patterns. The ancient alchemists understood that the mirror stage of their work, the reflectio, was essential for transformation. They knew that you cannot transmute what you cannot see clearly, that all real change begins with accurate self-perception. The manipulator, seeing themselves clearly in the mirror of your consciousness, has the opportunity to begin their own alchemical work, their own journey from the lead of unconscious reactivity to the gold of conscious choice. But whether they take that opportunity or not is ultimately beyond your control. Your role is simply to maintain the clarity of the mirror, to continue reflecting what is actually happening without distortion or judgment. Like the ancient temple mirrors, your consciousness becomes a sacred instrument of revelation, offering the gift of truth to anyone brave enough to look into its polished surface. The mirror's terrible honesty is terrible precisely because it cannot be argued with, manipulated, or controlled. It simply reflects what is, with the unwavering accuracy of light itself. And in that reflection, both the manipulator and you have the opportunity to see not just what you have been, but who you might become. When you choose consciousness over unconsciousness, authenticity over manipulation, truth over the comfortable illusions that keep you trapped in patterns that no longer serve your highest evolution. This is the ultimate gift of the mirror, not punishment or exposure for its own sake, but the possibility of transformation that can only come through clear, honest perception of what actually is. In that clarity, in that terrible and beautiful honesty, lies the seed of all genuine change, all authentic growth, all movement toward the kind of conscious relationships that nourish the soul rather than diminishing it. In the deepest chambers of the human psyche, where memory and imagination dance together in the twilight between truth and fiction, we find the birthplace of all the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and why we do what we do. These narratives, woven from threads of experience, expectation, and desperate need, become the invisible scripts that govern our relationships, the unspoken agreements about reality that allow us to function or dysfunction together in the complex theater of human connection. Every manipulative relationship is, at its core, a collaborative work of fiction, a shared delusion, maintained by two or more people, who have unconsciously agreed to perform predetermined roles in a drama that serves no one's authentic needs while appearing to serve everyone's defensive requirements. The manipulator steps into their chosen costume, perhaps the misunderstood victim, whose sensitivity is constantly trampled by an insensitive world, or the noble martyr, who sacrifices everything for ungrateful others, or the innocent childlike being who cannot possibly be held responsible for the chaos that seems to follow in their wake. Meanwhile, you find yourself assigned a complementary role in this psychological theater, the villain whose reasonable boundaries become evidence of your cruelty, the savior whose rescue attempts are never quite enough to heal the manipulator's endless wounds, or the perpetrator whose very existence seems to cause the manipulator such exquisite suffering that you must constantly atone for the sin of being yourself. These false narratives possess a seductive power that extends far beyond their obvious dysfunction. They offer both parties something that their authentic relationship might not provide, a sense of moral superiority for the manipulator, who gets to be the wronged party in every exchange, and a sense of importance for you, who gets to be central to someone else's drama, needed even if not truly valued. The stories provide structure in a world that often feels chaotic, roles to play when authentic selfhood feels too vulnerable or uncertain. The manipulator has typically spent years perfecting their narrative, refining their character through countless rehearsals with different co-stars, learning exactly which emotional buttons to press to elicit the responses that confirm their version of reality. They have become method actors in the story of their own victimhood or heroism, so deeply identified with their role that they may no longer remember where the performance ends and their authentic self begins. You, meanwhile, have been gradually inducted into this theater through a process so subtle that you may not even realize you are performing. The manipulator has trained you through thousands of micro-interactions to respond in ways that support their narrative. When they play the victim, You automatically step into the role of either the rescuer who must fix their pain, or the villain who has caused it. When they play the martyr, you become either the ungrateful recipient of their sacrifice or the guilty party who demands too much. But then comes the moment when the sacred words are spoken, when consciousness penetrates the elaborate set construction of this psychological theater. I notice that when I ask you to respect my boundaries, you immediately begin talking about how much you've sacrificed for me. The words land in the middle of the performance like a spotlight suddenly illuminating the artifice of the stage, revealing the painted backdrops, the hidden wires, the carefully placed props that create the illusion of reality. In that moment, the entire collaborative fiction begins to tremble on its foundation. The manipulator, so accustomed to having their narrative accepted without question, suddenly finds themselves exposed not as the character they have been playing, but as an actor playing a character. The careful construction of their reality, built through strategic emotional displays, selective memory, and the constant reframing of events to fit their chosen story, is revealed as exactly that, a construction, not an inevitable truth. That's interesting, you're asking me to trust you while simultaneously telling me that my feelings are wrong. The words cut through layers of projection and counter-projection, past the elaborate justifications and emotional manipulations, to the simple, undeniable reality of what is actually happening in this moment. The Emperor's new clothes, invisible to everyone who has been complicit in the shared delusion, are suddenly revealed to be nothing more than naked self-deception. The collapse of these false narratives rarely happens gently. Like any structure built on unstable foundations, the psychological theater tends to crumble dramatically once its supporting illusions are removed. The manipulator, faced with the sudden dissolution of their carefully maintained reality, may experience something akin to panic. Their entire sense of self, so thoroughly identified with their role in this drama, feels threatened with annihilation. This is when the manipulator often escalates their performance, attempting to draw you back into the familiar roles that have sustained their narrative. They may become more dramatically victimized, more intensely martyred, more convincingly innocent, desperately trying to resurrect the shared delusion that has served them so well for so long. They may accuse you of cruelty for refusing to play your assigned part, of abandonment for stepping out of character, of betrayal for seeing through their performance to the vulnerable human being beneath the theatrical mask. But here lies one of the most profound gifts of this collapse. It reveals not just the falseness of the manipulator's narrative, but the authentic human being who has been hiding behind it, stripped of their dramatic costumes, forced to exist without their elaborate stage props. The manipulator may suddenly appear more genuinely vulnerable than they have in years. The real wounds that drove them to create such elaborate defensive strategies may finally become visible, no longer disguised by theatrical presentations of suffering, but revealed in their raw, unperformed state. I don't understand how asking you to listen to my concerns makes me responsible for your depression. The words strip away another layer of narrative construction, revealing the impossible logic that manipulation requires the magical thinking that transforms reasonable requests into evidence of cruelty, that makes the manipulator's emotional reactions into the other person's responsibility, that turns healthy boundaries into acts of aggression. This stripping away of false logic is particularly devastating to the manipulative system, because manipulation relies entirely on the acceptance of irrational connections between cause and effect. The manipulator has trained you to believe that your actions directly cause their emotional states, that your needs somehow create their suffering, that your authenticity is inherently harmful to their well-being. When these connections are exposed as fabrications, the entire edifice of guilt and responsibility that supports the manipulative relationship begins to crumble. The collapse reveals something else that may have been hidden for years. Your own authentic responses no longer filtered through the requirements of your assigned role in the manipulator's drama. When you stop performing as the villain, the rescuer, or the perpetrator, you may discover feelings and perceptions that have been suppressed in service of maintaining the shared fiction. You may find anger where you have only allowed yourself to feel guilt, clarity where you have only permitted confusion, strength where you have only acknowledged your supposed inadequacy. "That doesn't work for me," becomes not just a response to a specific request, but a wholesale rejection of your assigned role in the manipulator's theater. It is a declaration of independence from the false narrative, a refusal to continue participating in a story that diminishes your authentic self in service of supporting someone else's defensive construction of reality. This refusal to participate often triggers what might be called a narrative crisis in the manipulator. Their story about themselves and their relationships requires your participation to maintain its believability. When you step out of your role, their entire worldview begins to lose coherence. They may experience genuine confusion, unable to make sense of interactions that don't fit their established patterns of understanding. Some manipulators respond to this crisis by attempting to write new scripts, assigning you different roles that might draw you back into the drama. If you refuse to play the villain, they may try casting you as the abandoner. If you won't perform as the rescuer, they may attempt to make you the cold, unfeeling one who lacks compassion for their struggles. The desperation with which they try these various narrative approaches reveals just how dependent their sense of self has become on maintaining these fictional frameworks. But others may respond to the collapse of their false narratives with something resembling relief. The effort required to maintain such elaborate fictions is enormous, demanding constant vigilance to ensure that reality doesn't intrude too forcefully on their constructed version of events. When the illusion finally crumbles, some manipulators discover a kind of exhausted gratitude for the opportunity to exist without the burden of their performance. "I'm not responsible for your emotions," cuts to the very heart of the false narrative's power structure. It refuses the assignment of magical causation that manipulation requires, the belief that one person's actions directly create another person's emotional states. It returns emotional responsibility to its rightful owner, while maintaining space for genuine empathy and care. This phrase often triggers the deepest narrative crisis because it challenges the manipulator's fundamental assumption about how relationships work. They have organized their entire relational strategy around the belief that others are responsible for managing their emotional states, that love means protecting them from the natural consequences of their own behavior, that care requires the sacrifice of your own authenticity to maintain their comfort. When this central assumption is challenged, the manipulator faces a choice that may be the most significant of their psychological development. They can either learn to take responsibility for their own emotional experience, or they can find new victims who will accept the role of emotional caretaker. This choice determines whether the collapse of their false narrative becomes a crisis that drives them deeper into manipulation, or an awakening that opens the possibility for authentic relationship. The process of narrative collapse is not without its own dangers for you as well. Having organized so much of your identity around your role in the manipulator's drama, you may experience your own crisis of meaning when that structure dissolves. Who are you when you're not the rescuer, the villain, the perpetrator? What is your value when it's not defined by your usefulness to someone else's emotional management? This identity crisis, uncomfortable as it may be, represents a profound opportunity for authentic self-discovery. Released from the constraints of your assigned role, you can begin to explore who you actually are, rather than who you have been trained to be. You may discover interests, feelings, and desires that have been suppressed in service of maintaining the manipulative theater. You may find aspects of your personality that have been dormant, waiting for the freedom to emerge from behind the mask of your performed self. The collapse of false narratives also reveals the possibility of true intimacy, the kind of connection that exists between authentic selves rather than between performed roles. When the manipulator can no longer hide behind their dramatic persona and you refuse to perform your assigned character, there exists the possibility, however fragile, of two real human beings meeting each other without the mediation of defensive strategies. This authentic meeting may be terrifying for both parties. The manipulator has likely created their elaborate theater precisely to avoid the vulnerability that genuine intimacy requires. You may have accepted your role partially to avoid the responsibility that comes with claiming your full autonomy and authentic selfhood. The collapse forces both of you to confront the possibility of real relationship, with all its attendant risks and rewards. The ancient wisdom traditions speak of the necessity of destroying false idols before true worship can begin. In the realm of psychological relationship, the collapse of false narrative serves a similar function, clearing away the elaborate constructions that prevent genuine human connection. The theater must be dismantled before the cathedral of authentic intimacy can be built in its place. This dismantling is not destruction for its own sake, but clearing for the sake of what might grow in ground no longer choked with the weeds of false stories. When the shared delusions finally crumble, they leave behind fertile soil in which something true and nourishing might finally take root. The possibility of relationships based on reality rather than fantasy, on authentic need rather than manufactured drama, on genuine care rather than the codependent dance of victim and rescuer. The collapse of false narratives is ultimately an act of compassion for both parties. Though it may not feel compassionate in the moment of disillusionment, it offers the manipulator the opportunity to discover who they are beyond their performed victimhood, and it offers you the chance to reclaim your authentic self from the roles that have confined and diminished it. In the ruins of the psychological theater, new possibilities for genuine human connection can finally begin to emerge. In the wild, predators possess an exquisite sensitivity to the subtle signals of vulnerability that mark their prey, the slight limp that suggests weakness, the nervous glance that reveals fear, the trembling that betrays uncertainty. They have evolved over millennia to read these signals with perfect accuracy, to position themselves with strategic precision, to strike at the moment when their target is most defenseless. Their survival depends on this ancient dance between hunter and hunted, predator and prey. The emotional predator operates with this same primal intelligence, honed not through evolutionary pressures, but through countless encounters with wounded human beings who have learned to signal their availability for exploitation through the subtle language of the soul. They can sense with supernatural accuracy the person who apologizes for existing, who carries guilt like an invisible weight, who has been trained to prioritize others' comfort over their own truth. They recognize the scent of unhealed trauma, the frequency of codependency, the particular vibration of a human being who has never learned to say no without feeling like a criminal. This predator has developed their hunting strategy through years of careful observation and experimentation. They have learned precisely which emotional buttons to press to elicit guilt, which stories to tell to trigger your rescuer complex, which displays of vulnerability will activate your compulsive need to fix what is broken in others. They know how to position themselves as the exception to your healthy boundaries, the special case that requires you to abandon your self-care, the unique situation that demands you sacrifice your own well-being on the altar of their endless need. Their approach is typically gradual, methodical, like a spider carefully constructing its web strand by strand. First comes the love bombing, the overwhelming display of attention and affection that feels like the answer to every prayer you never knew you were making. They mirror your dreams back to you with uncanny accuracy, reflect your deepest desires in their own carefully crafted persona, become everything you never knew you always wanted. This initial phase serves multiple purposes. It bonds you to them through artificial intimacy while simultaneously gathering intelligence about your wounds, your needs, your secret fears and desperate longings. Once this foundation is established, the true manipulation begins. But it arrives not as a sudden assault, but as a gentle erosion, like water slowly wearing away stone. Your boundaries are tested with such subtlety that you may not even notice their dissolution. Your self-trust is undermined through carefully planted seeds of doubt that grow into forests of self-questioning. Your reality is gradually replaced with their construction of events, so skillfully and persistently that you begin to trust their version of your own experience more than your direct perception. The emotional predator becomes a master of your internal landscape, mapping your psychological terrain with the precision of a cartographer. They know exactly which approach will make you feel selfish for having needs, which story will make you feel guilty for setting limits, which display of pain will make you abandon your own truth in service of their emotional management. They have turned your compassion into a weapon against your own well-being, transforms your capacity for love into a tool for your own diminishment. But then something unprecedented happens. Instead of the familiar responses they have come to expect and depend upon, the guilt, the confusion, the desperate attempts to explain yourself and restore their approval, they encounter something entirely outside their experience. You speak those simple, clear words, "I notice," and in that moment, their entire hunting strategy suddenly becomes not only ineffective, but transparent. The predator experiences a kind of cognitive dissonance that they may have never encountered before. Their carefully calibrated emotional manipulations, which have worked with surgical precision on countless other targets, suddenly meet an immovable object. It is as though they have spent years perfecting their technique on clay only to suddenly encounter diamond. Their familiar tools not only fail to penetrate, but actually reveal their own inadequacy. I notice that when I express a concern, you immediately begin talking about how much worse your life is than mine. The words land with devastating simplicity in the predator's consciousness. They have spent so much energy perfecting the art of deflection, becoming virtuosos of the victim switch, masters of the comparative suffering game. But now their technique is not just failing, it is being observed, named, and reflected back to them with the clarity of a mirror. This naming creates a profound disorientation in the predator's psyche. They have operated for so long in the shadowlands of implication and suggestion, relying on your unconsciousness to make their manipulations effective. Their power has always depended on your inability to see clearly what they were doing. When you suddenly demonstrate not only that you can see their tactics, but that you can articulate them with calm precision, their entire sense of themselves as masterful manipulators begins to crumble. The predator may respond to this initial shock with escalation, attempting to overwhelm your newfound clarity with increased emotional intensity. They might become more dramatically victimized, more urgently needy, more convincingly wounded. They are like a musician whose subtle melody has been ignored, now attempting to capture attention through sheer volume. But these escalated tactics only serve to make their behavior even more visible in the clear light of your awareness. That's interesting. You're asking me to trust you while simultaneously telling me that my perceptions are wrong. The words cut through their escalated performance with surgical precision. The predator discovers that their increased intensity not only fails to achieve its desired effect, but actually works against them, making their manipulative strategies even more transparent and obvious. At this point, the predator may experience something akin to panic. Their tried and true methods are not just failing, they are backfiring, revealing them to be exactly what they have always denied being: someone who attempts to control others through emotional manipulation. The careful image they have constructed of themselves as the innocent party, the misunderstood victim, the person who is simply more sensitive than others, begins to dissolve in the acid of your clear observation. This is when many predators attempt to shift tactics entirely, abandoning their familiar strategies in favor of approaches they may have never used before. They might try direct aggression, having exhausted the effectiveness of subtle manipulation. They might attempt to guilt you about your new boundaries, painting your clarity as evidence of your cruelty or lack of love. They might even try genuine vulnerability, though their unfamiliarity with authentic emotional expression often makes these attempts feel stilted and artificial. I don't understand how my asking you to respect my time becomes proof that I don't care about your feelings. This response to their guilt attempt creates another layer of disorientation. The predator has invested tremendous energy in constructing elaborate logical frameworks that justify their manipulative behavior, complex cause and effect relationships that make your reasonable boundaries appear unreasonable, your healthy needs seem selfish. When these constructions are met with genuine confusion rather than acceptance, their illogical nature becomes undeniable. The predator may find themselves, perhaps for the first time in years, having to actually explain their reasoning rather than simply expecting it to be accepted. This requirement to make explicit what has always been implicit often reveals the fundamental absurdity of their position. They discover that their manipulative logic, which seems so convincing in the shadows of suggestion, becomes obviously manipulative when forced into the light of direct articulation. That doesn't work for me. Introduces an entirely foreign concept into the predator's worldview. Throughout their manipulative career, they have encountered people who might resist, who might argue, who might even fight back, but rarely have they encountered someone who simply opts out of their entire framework. This phrase doesn't engage with their manipulation. It doesn't attempt to counter their arguments or match their emotional intensity. It simply states a boundary that exists as surely as mountains exist, as certainly as gravity operates. The predator may find this response more disorienting than any other, because it offers them nothing to work with. They cannot argue with your personal preferences. They cannot manipulate your sovereign choice about what works for you and what doesn't. They cannot guilt you out of your own reality or pressure you into changing your fundamental needs. The phrase creates a kind of psychological force field that their familiar tactics cannot penetrate. This is when the predator often experiences what might be called technique collapse. Having exhausted their familiar strategies and found them all ineffective, they may find themselves genuinely at a loss for how to proceed. They have built their entire relational approach around the assumption that others can be manipulated through emotional pressure, and suddenly they are face to face with someone who appears to be immune to their influence. The final sacred phrase, "I'm not responsible for your emotions," often triggers the most profound confusion of all. The predator's entire strategy has been built on the foundation of emotional responsibility transfer, the idea that others must manage their feelings, accommodate their moods, and sacrifice their own needs to maintain the predator's emotional equilibrium. This phrase doesn't just reject a particular manipulation, it rejects the entire premise on which their manipulative worldview is constructed. The predator may experience genuine bewilderment at this point. They have spent so long assuming that love means emotional caretaking, that care requires the sacrifice of boundaries, that relationship involves the management of others' feelings, that they literally may not know how to function in an interaction where these assumptions don't apply. It is as though they have been playing chess their entire lives and suddenly discovered that the other person is playing an entirely different game with completely different rules. This confusion often manifests as a kind of desperate cycling through their entire repertoire of manipulative techniques. Like a keychain of skeleton keys that no longer fit any lock, they may try approach after approach, each one meeting the same calm, clear response. They may attempt to recreate the conditions that made their manipulation effective in the past, manufacturing crises, creating urgencies, generating drama, only to discover that these familiar triggers no longer produce their intended effects. Some predators respond to this confusion with rage, furious at your refusal to play by rules that have always worked before. Others may become genuinely depressed, confronting perhaps for the first time the poverty of their relational strategy and the superficiality of the connections they have created through manipulation. Still others may experience a kind of existential crisis, questioning fundamental assumptions about human nature and relationship that have guided their behavior for decades. But in some predators, this confusion opens a doorway to genuine self-reflection. Stripped of their familiar tools and faced with their own ineffectiveness, they may begin to question not just their techniques, but the wounds and fears that drove them to develop such elaborate manipulative strategies in the first place. The person who has spent years controlling others through emotional manipulation may suddenly find themselves confronting the terror of genuine vulnerability that originally drove them to seek control. This moment of potential awakening is both fragile and profound. The predator, having exhausted their arsenal of manipulative techniques, faces a choice. They can either seek new victims who will respond to their familiar approaches, or they can begin the difficult work of learning to relate authentically. This choice determines whether their confusion becomes a temporary setback in their predatory career, or the beginning of genuine psychological transformation. The confusion you witness in the predator serves as a kind of diagnostic tool, revealing the extent to which their entire sense of self has been built around their ability to manipulate others. Those who experience only frustration or anger may be too identified with their predatory strategies to easily change. Those who experience genuine bewilderment or even curiosity about your responses may be closer to the possibility of authentic relationship. Your role in witnessing this confusion is neither to take advantage of the predator's disorientation nor to rescue them from it. The confusion is a natural consequence of their manipulative strategies meeting consciousness, a necessary stage in the potential transformation of their approach to relationship. Whether they use this confusion as an opportunity for growth or simply as motivation to find more compliant victims is ultimately beyond your control. What you can control is your commitment to maintaining the clear, conscious responses that created this confusion in the first place. By continuing to offer simple observations, genuine curiosity, authentic confusion at their illogical constructions, clear boundaries about what works for you, and consistent refusal to take responsibility for their emotions, you create a consistent environment in which their manipulative strategies cannot flourish. The predator's confusion, uncomfortable as it may be for them to experience, is actually a gift, both to them and to you. For them, it offers the possibility of discovering more authentic ways of getting their needs met. For you, it provides confirmation that your new approach is working, that you have successfully extracted yourself from the predator-prey dynamic that once defined your relationship. In the ecology of human relationship, predators can only exist where there is available prey. By refusing to play the role of victim, by meeting manipulation with consciousness rather than unconsciousness, by maintaining your psychological sovereignty in the face of emotional pressure, you transform the entire relational ecosystem. The confusion you witness in the predator is evidence that this transformation is working, that the old patterns of exploitation and victimization are giving way to something new, the possibility of relationship based on mutual respect rather than predatory manipulation. This confusion marks the end of one kind of relationship and the potential beginning of another. Whether what emerges from the ashes of the predatory dynamic is genuine intimacy or simply the recognition that no authentic relationship is possible between you depends largely on the predator's willingness to trade the familiar comfort of control for the unknown territory of authentic human connection. In the depths of human becoming, there arrives a moment when the soul learns to speak its own name, not the name given by others, not the identity borrowed from expectation or fear, but the true name that emerges from the marriage of consciousness and authenticity. This is the moment when boundaries are no longer walls built in panic, no longer barriers erected from the rubble of past wounds, but sacred demarcations that arise naturally from the fertile ground of self-knowledge. For too long we have misunderstood the nature of boundaries. We have seen them as acts of aggression, as declarations of war against the world that seeks to consume us. We have built them from anger, mortared them with resentment, and wondered why they crumble under the weight of our own exhaustion. But authentic boundaries, the boundaries of the individuated soul, are not born from opposition. They are born from clarity. They emerge not as reactions to what we fear, but as expressions of what we know to be true. The person who has walked the path of inner transformation, who has descended into their own depths and returned with the treasure of self-understanding, no longer needs to scream their boundaries into existence. They no longer need to justify their limits or apologize for their truth. They speak with the quiet authority that comes only from those who have met themselves in the darkness and found themselves worthy of protection. I see what you're doing. These are not words of accusation, but words of recognition. The individuated consciousness has developed what Jung called the superior function, the ability to perceive clearly without the distortion of projection or the fog of unconscious reactivity. When we truly see, we are no longer caught in the web of another's unconscious patterns. We are no longer drawn into the dance of manipulation or control because we recognize the steps before the music begins. This seeing is not cold or clinical. It is the warm recognition of one human soul acknowledging the patterns and strategies of another. It is the compassionate witness saying, I understand that you are acting from your own woundedness, your own unconscious compulsions, your own desperate need to feel safe or in control. There is no judgment in this seeing, no superiority, only the clear-eyed recognition of what is. I understand why you're doing it. Here lies the profound wisdom of the integrated psyche. The person who has faced their own shadow, who has wrestled with their own demons and found peace with their own darkness, can look upon the unconscious behaviors of others without being triggered into reactivity. They understand that all human behavior, no matter how destructive or manipulative, arises from some fundamental need, the need to be seen, to be valued, to feel secure, to maintain some sense of control in an uncertain world. This understanding is born not from intellectual analysis, but from the deep knowing that comes through self-acceptance. When we have made peace with our own capacity for selfishness, manipulation, and unconscious harm, we can witness these same qualities in others without the need to punish or fix. We see the wounded child beneath the adult behavior, the frightened ego beneath the controlling persona, the unlived life beneath the rigid defenses. But understanding does not mean participation. Compassion does not require complicity. Love does not demand self-sacrifice. And here we arrive at the revolutionary truth that transforms martyrs into authentic beings. I will not participate. These words carry the weight of integration. They emerge from the depths of a psyche that has learned to distinguish between love and enabling, between kindness and self-betrayal, between service and sacrifice. The individuated soul understands that true love sometimes requires the courage to disappoint, to refuse, to stand apart from the unconscious patterns that bind others in suffering. This refusal is not born from coldness, but from clarity. It is not an act of rejection, but an act of sacred protection, protection of one's own energy, one's own truth, one's own carefully cultivated inner peace. The person who speaks these words has learned that their presence in the world is a gift, not an obligation, and that this gift loses its power when given unconsciously or under duress. In the mythological language that speaks to the depths of the human soul, this is the moment when the hero refuses the false call, not the true call to adventure, but the siren song that would lead them away from their authentic path. It is Odysseus choosing to plug his ears against the songs that would crash him upon the rocks of unconscious participation. It is the wise woman in the fairy tale who knows which path leads to the castle and which leads to the wolf's den. The authentic boundary is like the membrane of a healthy cell, permeable to what nourishes and strengthens, impermeable to what would poison or destroy. It does not shut out the world in fear, but it discriminates with the wisdom of life itself. It allows love to flow freely while preventing the invasion of unconscious patterns that would diminish or deplete. Jung spoke of the transcendent function, the psychological mechanism by which conscious and unconscious contents are united in a living symbol. The authentic boundary is itself a transcendent function, uniting the wisdom of experience with the courage of action, the compassion of understanding with the strength of refusal, the love of connection with the wisdom of separation. When we learn to set boundaries from this integrated place, we discover that they are not barriers to relationship, but the very foundation upon which authentic relationship becomes possible. For it is only when we know where we end and others begin that we can meet them truly. It is only when we are clear about our own needs and limits that we can give freely, without resentment. It is only when we stop trying to fix or save or change others that we can love them as they are. The person who has learned to speak these 5 words, I see what you're doing, I understand why you're doing it, and I will not participate, has achieved something precious in the realm of human development. They have learned to hold 2 seemingly opposite truths simultaneously, the truth of compassionate understanding and the truth of personal sovereignty. They have discovered that love does not require the dissolution of boundaries, but their clarification. This is the wisdom of the integrated heart, the heart that has learned to beat in rhythm with its own truth rather than in reactive response to the chaos of others. It is the wisdom of the embodied soul that knows its own value not as something to be proven or defended, but as something to be honored and protected through conscious choice. In the alchemical language of transformation, this is the moment when lead becomes gold, not through force or pressure, but through the natural process of conscious refinement. The dross of unconscious reaction falls away, leaving behind the pure essence of authentic response. The person who can speak these words without anger, without guilt, without the need to justify or explain, has achieved a form of inner sovereignty that no external force can threaten. But perhaps most importantly, these boundaries create space for others to face their own unconscious patterns, without the cushion of our enabling participation, space for authentic relationship to emerge from beneath the debris of codependent dance, space for love to flow freely, rather than being squeezed through the narrow channels of obligation and fear. The authentic boundary is ultimately an act of service to the highest possibility within ourselves and others, service to the evolution of consciousness that seeks to express itself through human relationship, service to the truth that sets us free even when that freedom feels uncomfortable or unfamiliar. For in the end, we discover that boundaries are not about building walls, but about creating sacred space where the authentic self can breathe, where love can flow without condition, where truth can be spoken without apology, and where the dance of human relationship can unfold in all its magnificent complexity without losing the essential core of who we are. This is the gift of individuated consciousness, the ability to remain ourselves while loving others, to stay present while refusing participation in unconscious patterns, to offer our hearts while protecting our souls. In learning to speak these words with clarity and compassion, we become beacons of integrated humanity, showing others, through our example, that it is possible to love fully without losing oneself, to give generously without depleting one's essence, to engage deeply while maintaining the sacred sovereignty of an awakened soul. In the ancient teachings of mystics and sages, there exists a profound understanding that consciousness itself is contagious, but awakening in one being inevitably creates the conditions for awakening in others. Like a single candle lighting 1,000 others without diminishing its own flame, the moment when you speak those sacred words with authentic presence sends invisible waves of possibility rippling outward through the vast web of human connection, touching lives and transforming relationships in ways you may never fully know or understand. The immediate epicenter of this transformation is, of course, the manipulator themselves. When their familiar strategies suddenly prove ineffective, when their emotional hooks find no purchase on the smooth surface of your consciousness, they face a choice that may determine the trajectory of not only their relationships but their entire psychological evolution. Some, as we have explored, will seek new victims, people whose wounds and unconscious patterns make them available for the old manipulative strategies, but others, confronted with the mirror of your awareness, may begin their own difficult journey toward authentic relationship. This choice reverberates through their other relationships like seismic waves through geological formations. The manipulator, who has been forced to confront the reality of their own behavior in relationship with you, may find it increasingly difficult to maintain unconscious manipulation with others. Their partner, children, friends, colleagues, all may suddenly encounter a person who is slightly more awake to their own patterns, slightly more conscious of their automatic responses, slightly more available for genuine intimacy rather than strategic emotional management. Even when the manipulator chooses to seek new victims rather than transform their consciousness, this choice itself creates ripples of awareness. Those who witness their departure, their sudden withdrawal of attention and energy, may begin to recognize patterns they had previously accepted as normal. The friend who watches the manipulator suddenly lose interest in them when they begin setting boundaries. The family member who observes the manipulator's dramatic exits when their emotional territory is no longer available for occupation. These witnesses receive their own transmission of possibility, but perhaps the most profound ripples emerge from the example you yourself provide through your transformed responses. When others witness your refusal to participate in unconscious dynamics, when they observe your capacity to maintain center in the face of emotional assault, when they hear you speak those simple, powerful words with calm authenticity, they encounter a living demonstration that another way of being is possible. They see embodied proof that one need not be a victim of others' emotional manipulations, that consciousness can indeed triumph over unconscious reactivity. Your colleagues may notice that you no longer apologize for expressing your professional needs, that you respond to passive-aggressive behavior with clear observation rather than defensive explanation. Your family members may observe that you meet guilt-inducing commentary with genuine curiosity rather than automatic compliance. Your friends may witness you declining invitations that don't serve you without elaborate justifications or apologies. Each of these interactions plants seeds of possibility in their own consciousness, seeds that may lie dormant for months or years before suddenly sprouting into their own transformations. The ripple effect extends beyond direct observation to something more subtle but equally powerful, the shift in the entire energetic field that occurs when someone moves from unconscious reactivity to conscious response. Others may not be able to articulate what has changed about you, but they sense a different quality in your presence, a groundedness that wasn't there before, a kind of psychological gravity that attracts authentic interaction while repelling manipulative approaches. This energetic shift often manifests as what might be called authentic magnetism, the natural tendency of conscious beings to attract others who are ready for genuine relationship, while simultaneously becoming less available to those who operate primarily through manipulation and unconscious projection. People may find themselves drawn to you without understanding why, sensing in your presence something they hunger for in their own lives, the possibility of being seen and accepted for who they truly are rather than for the roles they perform or the needs they fulfill for others. The manipulators in your extended network may begin to avoid you instinctively, sensing that their usual strategies will not work in your presence. This creates space for more authentic relationships to emerge, relationships based on mutual respect rather than unconscious neediness, on genuine care rather than codependent rescue dynamics. The quality of your social interactions may shift dramatically as you attract people who are capable of reciprocal intimacy, while naturally repelling those who seek to feed off others' emotional energy. Children who witness your transformed responses receive perhaps the most precious gift of all, a living example of psychological sovereignty that may prevent them from developing the people-pleasing patterns that make manipulation possible. When they observe you, maintaining your boundaries with calm firmness, when they hear you speak those sacred words without drama or defensiveness, when they witness you refusing to take responsibility for others' emotional reactions, they receive a template for their own healthy development. The child who sees an adult respond to manipulation with consciousness, rather than reactivity, learns that they too have choices in how they respond to others' attempts to control their behavior through emotional pressure. They begin to understand, not through lectures but through lived example, that their worth is not dependent on their willingness to sacrifice their own needs for others' comfort, that love does not require the abandonment of personal boundaries, that they can care deeply for others without taking responsibility for managing their emotions. These children may grow into adults who naturally recognize manipulative behavior and respond to it with the same clear consciousness they witnessed in you. They become links in a chain of transformation that extends across generations, each one passing on to the next, the profound gift of psychological freedom you first claimed through your willingness to speak those simple, powerful words. The ripple effect reaches into professional environments where your transformed presence may inspire colleagues to examine their own patterns of workplace manipulation and boundary violations. The employee who witnesses you responding to passive-aggressive management with clear observation rather than anxious compliance may find courage to address their own workplace challenges with greater authenticity. The supervisor who observes your refusal to take responsibility for subordinates' emotional reactions may begin to examine their own tendency to use guilt and emotional pressure as management tools. In intimate relationships, the ripples may create the most dramatic transformations. Your partner, initially perhaps confused or even threatened by your new responses to manipulative behavior, may gradually discover the relief that comes from being in relationship with someone who takes responsibility for their own emotional experience, while refusing to manage others' feelings. They may find themselves inspired to examine their own unconscious patterns, to develop their own capacity for authentic communication, to risk the vulnerability that genuine intimacy requires. The friends who have been accustomed to relationships based on drama and crisis may initially resist your transformed responses, feeling threatened by your refusal to participate in unconscious dynamics. But those who are ready for growth may find in your example the courage to begin their own journey toward more conscious relationships. They may start recognizing their own patterns of emotional manipulation or victimhood, beginning to question dynamics they had previously accepted as simply how relationships work. Some of the most profound ripples occur in therapeutic and healing communities, where your example of conscious response to manipulation may inspire both practitioners and clients to examine the dynamics that keep people trapped in cycles of unconscious interaction. Therapists may recognize the power of teaching clients these simple phrases, these tools for maintaining psychological sovereignty in the face of emotional assault. Support groups may discover new ways of addressing codependency and manipulation that go beyond mere analysis to practical, embodied responses. The sacred words themselves begin to spread through networks of connection like beneficial viruses of consciousness, each person who learns to embody them becoming a carrier of transformation. Unlike destructive ideas that spread through fear and unconsciousness, these words propagate through the human community by demonstrating their effectiveness, by proving their power to liberate both speaker and listener from the prison of unconscious relational dynamics. The manipulators who encounter these words from multiple sources may find it increasingly difficult to maintain their unconscious strategies. As more people learn to respond to manipulation with clear consciousness rather than reactive unconsciousness, the manipulative person faces a shrinking pool of available victims. This external pressure, combined with the internal dissonance created by repeatedly encountering their own behavior reflected back to them, may eventually motivate even the most entrenched manipulator to begin examining their patterns. In some cases, the ripple effect creates what might be called therapeutic communities, networks of people who have all learned to respond to unconscious dynamics with consciousness, creating environments where manipulation simply cannot flourish. These communities, whether they form naturally around friendships, professional relationships, or shared interests, become laboratories for authentic human relating, spaces where people can experiment with genuine intimacy without the fear of being manipulated or exploited. The transformation ripples through online communities and social networks as well, where your example of conscious response to digital manipulation may inspire others to examine their own social media interactions, their responses to online drama, their participation in digital dynamics that mirror the same unconscious patterns that play out in face-to-face relationships. The person who witnesses you responding to online provocation with clear observation rather than defensive reaction may discover their own capacity to engage with social media from a place of consciousness rather than compulsive reactivity. Perhaps most significantly, the ripple effect contributes to what Jung identified as the evolution of the collective unconscious itself, the slow but steady transformation of the shared psychological patterns that characterize human consciousness in any given era. Each person who moves from unconscious reactivity to conscious response adds their energy to a growing wave of human awakening, a collective movement toward more authentic, more conscious, more genuinely intimate ways of relating. This transformation occurs not through preaching or teaching, but through the simple act of embodying a different way of being in relationship with others, like tuning forks that cause other instruments to resonate at the same frequency. Your conscious responses to unconscious behavior inspire others to find their own authentic voice, their own capacity for clear seeing, their own courage to speak truth in the face of manipulation. The sacred words become part of a growing vocabulary of liberation, joining other tools and practices that help human beings recognize and respond to unconscious patterns with increasing skill and awareness. They contribute to a cultural shift away from relationships based on manipulation, exploitation, and unconscious neediness, toward relationships characterized by mutual respect, authentic communication, and genuine care. The ultimate ripple effect of these words extends into the realm of what spiritual traditions call the healing of the world, the gradual transformation of human consciousness that occurs when enough individuals choose awareness over unconsciousness, truth over convenient fiction, authentic relating over manipulative strategy. Each time these words are spoken with genuine presence, each time someone chooses conscious response over unconscious reaction, the collective intelligence of humanity increases, the possibility for genuine peace and understanding expands, the hope for a world based on authentic love, rather than unconscious fear, grows stronger. In this way, your simple choice to speak these sacred words with authentic presence becomes part of the great work of human transformation, part of the ancient dream of consciousness awakening to itself through the vehicle of human relationship. The ripples you create through your refusal to participate in unconscious dynamics extend far beyond your immediate circle of relationships to touch the very fabric of human consciousness itself, contributing to the slow but steady evolution of our species toward greater awareness, deeper authenticity, and more genuine love. The 5 words, so simple in their construction, so profound in their effect, become your contribution to this great work of transformation, your offering to the collective human journey toward more conscious ways of being together on this earth. Through your willingness to speak them, to embody them, to live from the truth they represent, you become a catalyst for the healing of relationships, the awakening of consciousness, and the gradual but inexorable transformation of human civilization itself. There comes a moment in the journey of consciousness when we must turn our gaze toward the places we have refused to look, toward the shadowed corners of our own psyche where our capacity for darkness dwells. This is not the darkness of evil, but the darkness of denied potential, the raw power that we have split off from ourselves in our desperate attempt to be good, to be acceptable, to be loved. Until we reclaim this shadow power and integrate it consciously, we remain vulnerable to its unconscious expression through others, caught in endless cycles of projection and reaction that keep us from wielding authentic authority in our lives. The person who can speak the words, "I see what you're doing, I understand why you're doing it, and I will not participate," with true effectiveness, has undergone what the alchemists called the nigrido, the blackening, the descent into the underworld of the self, where all our disowned aspects wait in the darkness, like forgotten gods demanding recognition. They have met their own inner manipulator, their own controller, their own capacity for emotional violence, and instead of turning away in horror, they have extended the hand of consciousness toward these rejected parts of themselves. This is perhaps the most terrifying and transformative work of human development, to recognize that within us lies the same potential for unconscious harm that we see in others, the same patterns of manipulation that trigger our righteous anger when we encounter them in the world exist as dormant possibilities within our own psyche. The same controlling behaviors that we condemn in others arise from the same fundamental woundedness that lives within us. The same emotional violence that we refuse to tolerate from others flows through our own veins when we are unconscious, desperate, or afraid. Jung understood that the shadow is not the evil other, but the unlived life, the sum total of all the qualities, impulses, and potentials that we could not afford to acknowledge if we were to maintain our persona, our acceptable face to the world. In families where anger was forbidden, we learn to exile our rage to the shadow. In cultures where selfishness is condemned, we banish our healthy self-interest to the darkness. In relationships where vulnerability is dangerous, we cast our need for love into the realm of the rejected and denied. But what we do not realize in our innocent attempts at self-improvement is that when we reject these aspects of ourselves, we do not eliminate them, we simply make them unconscious. And in their unconscious state, they become far more dangerous than they ever were in the light of awareness. The person who has never acknowledged their capacity for manipulation becomes unconsciously manipulative. The individual who refuses to own their controlling nature becomes covertly controlling. The one who denies their anger becomes passive-aggressive, wielding emotional violence with the deadly precision of one who believes themselves incapable of harm. The shadow work required for authentic boundary setting begins with the humbling recognition that we are capable of everything we judge in others. This is not a cause for shame, but for profound relief, for it means we are finally becoming whole, finally reclaiming the parts of ourselves that we abandoned in childhood's desperate attempt to secure love and belonging. When we can look at our own capacity for manipulation without flinching, we develop the internal authority necessary to recognize and respond to manipulation in others without being swept into its current. This integration happens not through moral condemnation but through psychological understanding. We begin to see that our manipulative tendencies arose as creative survival strategies in environments where direct communication was dangerous or ineffective. Our controlling behaviors developed as attempts to create safety in chaotic or unpredictable circumstances. Our emotional violence emerged from the frustrated expression of legitimate needs and feelings that had no acceptable outlet. The person who has done this work can witness manipulation in others without the triggered reactivity that keeps us unconscious. They see the manipulation, yes, but they also see the wound beneath it, the creative adaptation, the survival strategy that once served a purpose but has now outlived its usefulness. This seeing does not lead to enabling or excusing, but to a clear-eyed compassion that can respond rather than react. When we have integrated our own shadow material, we discover something remarkable. We are no longer afraid of others' darkness because we have faced and befriended our own. The person who screams at us in anger cannot terrorize us because we have met our own rage and learned to dance with it. The individual who tries to manipulate us cannot hook us because we recognize the strategy from our own repertoire of survival tools. The one who seeks to control us cannot dominate us because we have reclaimed our own controlling nature and learned to direct it consciously rather than let it operate from the shadows. This is what Jung meant by the individuation process, not the achievement of perfection, but the conscious integration of all aspects of the self, both light and dark. The individuated person is not someone who has eliminated their capacity for harm, but someone who has brought that capacity into consciousness where it can be directed with wisdom, rather than allowed to operate destructively from the unconscious. The power that emerges from this integration is qualitatively different from ego power. Ego power seeks to dominate, to prove superiority, to win at the expense of others. It is reactive, defensive, and ultimately exhausting because it must constantly maintain its position through force or manipulation. The power of the integrated self, on the other hand, seeks not domination, but liberation. Liberation for oneself and, paradoxically, for others as well. When we can say, "I will not participate from this integrated place," we are not wielding a weapon against another person, but offering them the gift of encountering authentic response rather than unconscious reaction. We are refusing to enable their unconscious patterns, which may initially feel like abandonment or rejection, but ultimately serves their highest development. We are modeling what it looks like to maintain one's center in the face of psychological pressure, demonstrating that it is possible to love without losing oneself, to engage without being consumed. The fire of transformation that Jung referenced is the alchemical fire of consciousness itself, the burning away of illusions, the melting down of false identities, the purification of raw psychological material into conscious wisdom. Those who have been through this fire have learned to contain their own heat without being consumed by it. They can hold the tension of opposites, love and firmness, compassion and boundaries, understanding and refusal, without splitting into rigid positions or collapsing into confusion. This integration is not a one-time achievement but an ongoing practice, a daily choice to remain conscious, rather than slip back into the comfortable unconsciousness of projection and blame. It requires what the mystics called vigilance, the constant awareness of our own psychological processes, the willingness to catch ourselves when we begin to act from unconscious shadow material, the courage to own our projections and reclaim our disowned parts. The person who has done this work becomes a kind of psychological alchemist, able to transform the lead of unconscious reaction into the gold of conscious response. They can encounter others' shadow material without being infected by it because they have developed what we might call psychological immunity. Not the immunity of avoidance or denial, but the immunity that comes from having consciously engaged with and integrated similar material within themselves. In the mythological language that speaks to the depths of the psyche, this is the return of the hero from the underworld journey, having descended into the realm of the rejected and denied, having faced the monsters and demons that live in the basement of consciousness. They return to the upper world bearing gifts, the gifts of compassion born from self-knowledge, authority born from integration, and power born from wholeness, rather than compensation. But perhaps most importantly, this integration allows us to serve others' highest development rather than their unconscious patterns. When we refuse to participate in someone's manipulation, we are not punishing them, but offering them the opportunity to develop more conscious ways of meeting their needs. When we maintain our boundaries in the face of emotional violence, we are modeling the possibility of strength without aggression, firmness without cruelty. The integrated shadow becomes not a source of unconscious harm, but a wellspring of creative power. The person who has reclaimed their capacity for anger can set boundaries with clarity and strength. The individual who has owned their controlling nature can direct that energy toward conscious leadership rather than unconscious domination. The one who has faced their capacity for emotional violence can transform that raw energy into passionate advocacy for truth and justice. This is the profound paradox of shadow work. By embracing our darkness, we become more genuinely light. By acknowledging our capacity for harm, we develop the wisdom necessary to do no harm. By integrating our rejected aspects, we become whole enough to offer authentic love, rather than the compensatory gestures that arise from our splits and denials. The words, "I see what you're doing, I understand why you're doing it, and I will not participate," when spoken from this integrated place, carry the authority of lived experience. They are not theoretical positions but embodied truths, not moral judgments but psychological facts, not weapons of attack but tools of liberation. They emerge from the deep well of self-knowledge that can only be accessed by those brave enough to descend into their own depths and claim what they find there as their own. In the end, shadow integration is not about becoming more accepting of others' unconscious behavior, but about becoming less unconscious in our own responses. It is about developing the psychological maturity to remain present and conscious, even in the face of others' unconsciousness. It is about transforming from unconscious reactors to conscious responders, from victims of others' projections to clear mirrors that reflect back truth without distortion. This is the gift we offer the world when we do our shadow work, not the false light of denial and repression, but the genuine illumination that emerges when all aspects of the self are brought into conscious relationship with each other. We become living examples of what it means to be fully human, neither angel nor demon, but integrated beings capable of great love, precisely because we have faced and owned our capacity for its opposite. In the ancient wisdom of the East, there exists a concept known as the eternal return, the understanding that all spiritual journeys, no matter how far they may lead us into distant territories of consciousness, ultimately bring us back to the simple truth of who we have always been. Like rivers that flow through countless landscapes, yet always seek their way back to the sea, our journey through the labyrinth of psychological manipulation and liberation ultimately returns us to the pristine shores of our authentic self, enriched by the journey but fundamentally unchanged in our essential nature. These 5 sacred words I notice. That's interesting. I don't understand. That doesn't work for me. I'm not responsible for your emotions. Serve as more than mere tools for navigating manipulative relationships. They function as a kind of spiritual compass, their magnetic truth always pointing toward the North Star of authenticity, guiding us home to ourselves, regardless of how lost we may have become in the wilderness of others' projections and expectations. Each time we speak these words with genuine presence, each time we choose conscious response over unconscious reaction, we take another step on the path that Jung called individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming who we truly are, rather than who others need us to be. This path is not linear but spiral, bringing us repeatedly back to the same essential choices, the same fundamental questions, the same opportunities to choose authenticity over performance, truth over convenience, consciousness over the familiar comfort of unconscious patterns. The word notice returns us to the foundational truth of all spiritual practice, the cultivation of witness consciousness, that aspect of our being that can observe without being consumed, that can see without being blinded, that can recognize patterns without being trapped within them. When we say, "I notice," we step out of the role of unconscious participant and into the role of aware observer, reclaiming the sovereignty that manipulation seeks to erode through the fog of emotional confusion and guilt-inducing projection. This return to the witness is simultaneously a return to our essential nature as conscious beings. Before we learn to doubt our perceptions, before we were trained to prioritize others' emotional comfort over our own truth, before we accepted the role of emotional caretaker for others' unhealed wounds, we possessed this natural capacity to see clearly what was happening in any given moment. The sacred word notice reconnects us with this innate gift, this birthright of clear perception that manipulation seeks to cloud through the subtle arts of gaslighting and reality distortion. That's interesting, brings us back to what the Zen tradition calls beginner's mind, that state of open curiosity that approaches each moment fresh, without the burden of accumulated assumptions and defensive reactions. When we respond to manipulation with genuine interest rather than hurt or anger, we return to the childlike wonder that sees the world as an endlessly fascinating display of human behavior, rather than a threatening landscape of potential emotional assault. This return to curiosity is profoundly healing for both parties in the interaction. The manipulator, expecting to trigger your wounds and fears, instead encounters your genuine fascination with their psychological strategies. This response disrupts their familiar patterns so completely that it often creates space for their own authentic self to emerge from behind the masks of manipulation. Your curiosity becomes an invitation for them to remember who they are beneath their learned patterns of control and emotional manipulation. The phrase, "I don't understand," returns us to the sacred ground of honest intellectual humility, that willingness to admit when something makes no sense, rather than pretending to comprehend the incomprehensible. Manipulation often relies on elaborate logical constructions that fall apart under direct examination, complex cause and effect relationships that exist only in the manipulator's constructed reality. When we honestly state our confusion rather than trying to make sense of the senseless, we return to the solid ground of rational thought. This return to reason is not a retreat from emotional intelligence, but rather its fulfillment. True emotional intelligence includes the capacity to recognize when emotional arguments are being used to bypass rational thought, when feelings are being weaponized to circumvent healthy boundaries, when psychological pressure is being applied to make the irrational appear reasonable. The simple statement, "I don't understand," becomes a return to the clarity that manipulation seeks to destroy. "That doesn't work for me," brings us home to the fundamental truth of personal sovereignty. The recognition that we are the ultimate authority on our own experience, the final arbiters of what serves our authentic development and what does not. This phrase returns us to the understanding that we have not only the right but the responsibility to decline what doesn't align with our truth, regardless of how others might feel about our choices. This return to sovereignty often feels frightening initially because it requires us to take full responsibility for our lives, rather than allowing others to make our choices for us through emotional manipulation and guilt. But it is ultimately liberating because it reconnects us with our own power, our own wisdom, our own capacity to navigate life according to our deepest values, rather than others' expectations and demands. The final sacred phrase, "I'm not responsible for your emotions," returns us to perhaps the most fundamental boundary in human relationship, the recognition that while we can influence each other's feelings, we cannot and must not take responsibility for managing them. This statement brings us back to the truth that love and enabling are not the same thing, that care and codependency serve entirely different functions, that genuine compassion sometimes requires us to allow others to experience the natural consequences of their emotional choices. This return to appropriate responsibility is often the most challenging aspect of the journey, because it requires us to disappoint others whose love has always seemed conditional on our willingness to manage their emotional states. But it is also the most liberating because it frees us to offer genuine care and support while refusing to participate in the unconscious contracts that keep both parties trapped in cycles of manipulation and rescue. Together, these 5 phrases create a complete map for returning to authenticity in relationship. They guide us back from the foreign territory of others' projections and expectations to the familiar landscape of our own truth. They serve as landmarks on the journey home to ourselves, reliable reference points that help us navigate the sometimes confusing terrain of human interaction without losing our way in the maze of others' unconscious patterns. But the return to authenticity is not a destination we reach once and remain at forever. It is an eternal return, a continuous choice we make in each moment of interaction with others. Every conversation presents us with the opportunity to choose consciousness or unconsciousness, authenticity or performance, truth or the easier path of automatic compliance with others' emotional demands. The sacred words become internalized over time, transforming from conscious tools we remember to use into automatic responses that arise naturally from our integrated awareness. They become part of our psychological immune system, offering protection against manipulation while simultaneously creating space for genuine intimacy to flourish. Like antibodies that recognize and neutralize foreign invaders while allowing beneficial nutrients to nourish the body, these phrases automatically filter out manipulative attempts while welcoming authentic communication. This integration represents a fundamental shift in our way of being in the world. We move from reactive to responsive, from unconscious to aware, from victim to sovereign being. The manipulative strategies that once trapped us in cycles of guilt and compliance become simply interesting phenomena to observe, no more personally threatening than watching clouds pass across the sky. Yet this transformed state of being requires continuous cultivation. The old patterns of people-pleasing and conflict avoidance don't simply disappear once we learn these sacred words. They remain as potential defaults that we might slip back into during moments of stress or vulnerability. The return to authenticity is therefore not a single journey, but an ongoing practice, a daily choice to respond from our center rather than from our wounds. This practice deepens over time, becoming less effortful and more natural, as our authentic responses become our default way of being. The manipulative attempts that once created hours or days of internal turmoil begin to roll off us like water off a duck's back. We develop what might be called manipulation immunity, not an inability to be hurt by others, but an inability to be controlled by their attempts to manage our behavior through emotional pressure. This immunity extends beyond our interactions with obvious manipulators to influence all our relationships. We find ourselves naturally gravitating toward people who can engage authentically while losing interest in those who primarily relate through unconscious patterns of neediness and control. Our social circles may shift dramatically as we attract more conscious individuals, while naturally repelling those who seek to feed off others' emotional energy. The return to authenticity also transforms our relationship with ourselves. We develop what Jung called a right relation to the unconscious, the capacity to recognize our own shadow projections, our own attempts to control others through emotional manipulation, our own patterns of unconscious reactivity. The same clear seeing that protects us from others' manipulation also illuminates our own manipulative tendencies, creating opportunities for continuous self-awareness and growth. This self-awareness prevents us from becoming righteously identified with our new tools, from using our psychological insights as weapons against others rather than instruments of our own liberation. We recognize that we all have the capacity for manipulation when we're operating from our wounds, rather than our wholeness, that the difference between manipulator and victim often lies simply in which aspect of our shadow we're currently expressing. The sacred words thus serve not only as protection against others' unconscious patterns, but as reminders of our own capacity for unconscious behavior. They keep us humble, aware that our journey toward authenticity is ongoing rather than complete, that we too must remain vigilant against the subtle ways our own ego attempts to control outcomes through emotional manipulation. As we mature in our practice of these responses, we may find ourselves naturally becoming teachers and mentors for others who are still trapped in manipulative relationships, not through preaching or advice giving, but through the simple example of our own authentic responses to unconscious behavior. Others sense the freedom we've claimed and hunger for their own liberation from the prison of others' expectations and projections. This teaching happens through presence rather than words, through modeling rather than instruction. When others witness our refusal to be manipulated, our capacity to maintain our center in the face of emotional assault, our ability to respond with consciousness rather than reactivity, they receive a transmission that such freedom is possible for them as well. The eternal return to authenticity becomes, in this way, not just a personal journey, but a contribution to the collective awakening of human consciousness. Each person who learns to respond to manipulation with clear awareness, rather than unconscious reactivity, adds their light to the growing illumination of human relationships, their strength to the slowly building momentum toward more conscious ways of being together on this earth. In the end, these 5 sacred words reveal themselves to be more than tools for dealing with difficult people. They are keys to the kingdom of authentic selfhood, passwords to the realm of genuine intimacy, sacred utterances that call forth the deepest truth of who we have always been beneath all the roles and performances and defensive strategies we've learned to hide behind. They return us, again and again, to the simple recognition that we have a choice in every moment to speak truth or convenient fiction, to respond from our center or react from our wounds, to model consciousness or enable unconsciousness, to participate in authentic relationship or collude in the elaborate theater of manipulation and rescue. This choice made moment by moment, interaction by interaction, relationship by relationship, becomes the path itself, the eternal return to the authenticity that is our birthright, our true nature, our ultimate destination. And in claiming this authenticity and speaking these sacred words with genuine presence, we not only liberate ourselves from the prison of others' projections, but offer that same liberation to everyone whose life we touch through the mysterious alchemy of conscious relationship.